Good morning. I'm Temecula Mayor Mary Ann Edwards, and I welcome you to this special meeting of the Temecula City Council. So I'm going to call the meeting to order. And first, we're going to have our flag salute. I will lead that. And I have a flag right behind me, and so do several of the other council members. So if you could focus on one of those, unless you have one where you are. So if you please stand and put your right hand over your heart and repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And Madam City Clerk, could we have the roll call, please?
Yes, Madam Mayor. Councilmember Alexander is absent. Mayor Edwards?
Here.
Councilmember Ron?
Here.
Councilmember Schwank?
Here.
And Councilmember Stewart?
Here.
Thank you. So today our business is we're going to be conducting a workshop regarding race, equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is the READY initiative. And as many of you probably know, we have now appointed our READY Commission, and those members are seated and very busy already. They hit the ground running. So we have some guests here today who are going to do the presentation for us. We have Leon Andrews, right? Good morning. And where's my other person? He disappeared off my screen. Well, Leon, why don't you go first and you can introduce your colleagues.
Great, thank you, Mayor, and good morning to your council members and city leaders and to the city of Temecula. It's great to be with you today. Again, I'm Leon Andrews. I am the Director for Race, Equity, and Leadership at the National League of Cities. I am joined by two of my colleagues. I will have them introduce themselves. And so why don't we have Jordan go and then Jillian.
Good morning, everyone. Can folks hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. My name is Jordan Curry Carter. I use they and he pronouns. Grateful to share space with y'all today. Council members, the city of Temecula at large, and looking forward to our discussion.
Welcome, Jordan.
Pass it to Jillian.
I'm Jillian Gross-Fortgang. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also really glad to be together today. Thanks.
Good morning.
So I think I'll take it back. So what I would like to do is to just briefly walk through the objectives that we have. This is our second time with the full council. Enjoyed the time we had at the end of last year with back in November. And so what we'd like to do is really build on the space that we had together and wanted to create more space for places to have discussion and dialogue. And so I'm going to share my screen and walk through the objectives that we have for today, and building on again where we were back in November. And so we want to kind of reinforce concepts, terminology, and language. And so we did some of that when we were together in November and want to continue to create some of that space to not just to share it, but to have some discussion around it. And so hopefully, as we create some of the space, that discussion will be driven by some of the context that we'll set, providing some historical context, and really reflecting on how we think about its impact as we think about current events and understanding issues of understanding institutional and systemic racism in our country, and even how that's showing up in the city of Temecula. And then we're going to continue to reinforce this framework as the city continues to do this work. You know, we have found this framework to be very effective of how do you normalize, operationalize, and organize. And so we'll ground the time that we're together within that framework and continue to reinforce that. And so that will serve as primarily the time that we have together. And with towards the end, we'll kind of again continue to reintroduce some of the tools and our racial equity tools. So I'm going to turn it over to Jordan, who's going to walk us through the learning environment.
Thanks, Leon. So as we do get into this discussion today, first and foremost, want folks to recognize this as a brave space, meaning really offer what you can while you're in this space, but also ask for what you need. So if I am sharing language, or Leon, Jillian, your other colleagues on the council are using language that's unfamiliar, Please pause us either audibly or via the chat to let us know. And we can pause to make sure we have a literacy moment to ensure that we're all moving through the conversation with the same language. Other pieces here are really to note that what is learned here, we hope will leave here, and that you all will continue to have the discussions and move forward with your READY initiative within the city of Temecula. The other pieces are really to lean into the discomfort. So we will be discussing race, equity, racism during our time together, and the ways in which it has shown up historically as well as contemporarily. And oftentimes we can think about racism as one of those conversations that we put to the side or put on the shelf and don't want to have openly. And so as some discomfort may arise within yourself, we ask that you really lean into that discomfort with our time today, because growth and transformation is on the other side of that discomfort. So I'm going to ask that you continue to stay engaged with us. And then the last piece here is really just to start where you are. So just noting, again, we're all coming into this conversation with different lived experiences, as well as potentially the kind of content that you may be familiar with or resources that you've explored. And so really want to, again, just note, coming into this conversation is really about level setting, as well as the other objectives that Leon had mentioned on the previous slide. And with that, I want to just pause to pulse check with you all. Do those work for folks? If I could get a thumbs up, seeing some thumbs. Okay. Does anyone have additional offerings that they would like us to hold while we're in the space together? Okay, hearing none. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Leon. And Leon, you're on mute.
Thank you, Jordan. As we gather to reflect today, learn, and grow in our awareness of the past and how it informs the present and the future, we begin by acknowledging the land. As we acknowledge the land, we reflect on the ancestors of the Temecula Indians. Were here as early as 900 AD. The people from here to the coast who shared the same language and culture were known as the Luceño, because many of their villages were once under the influence of the Mission San Luis Rey. The Pachanga band of the Luceño Indians has called the Temecula Valley home more than 10,000 years. Bedrock mortars, stone tools, pottery, and rock art are still found in Riverside and San Diego counties. These artifacts are evidence of a long history and a rich culture that existed before the arrival of the Spanish missionaries. By the time the missions were secularized in 1834, the population had been decimated, and many Luceño were living in small, isolated villages throughout the Temecula Valley. The Mexican-American War, the Temecula Massacre, California statehood, and the failed promises of the Treaty of Temecula took on an added toll on the original inhabitants of this land. But despite losing nearly everything they owned in the Temecula eviction of 1875, the Temecula people found ways to survive. The Pachanga Reservation was established in 1882, and the struggle for survival continued through the early 20th century.
Leon, it's Pachanga.
Pachanga, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for that correction, appreciate that. So is it Pachanga? Am I saying that correctly? The Pachanga Reservation was established in 1882, and the struggle for the survival continued through the early 20th century. 1919 marked the establishment of the Mission Indian Federation, MIF, the first Native American civil rights group in Southern California. The MIF fought for Indian civil rights for over 50 years during the US government Indians termination policy period. With the passage of the Southern California Indian Land Transfer Act in 1988, the Pechanga Reservation now stands at over 7,000 acres. Today, tribal government operations and cultural resource management exist to fully honor and protect the land and cultural sites. In their own words, the Pechanga tribe invests in preserving and practicing our many traditional ways, knowing our customs, our traditions connect us to our worldview as individuals and a community. We will continue to help our people and the communities of the Temecula Valley remain self-sufficient and forward-thinking for many years to come. So this land was their home long before we made it ours. And appreciate Mayor for the correction, because obviously for us, even as we are mindful of how we identify, being able to identify and make sure we're saying names correctly is also a really important part of identification. So appreciate us making sure we're clear about naming it Pechanga correctly, and also acknowledging as we're acknowledging their land. So thank you for that. So as we acknowledge the land, we also just want to acknowledge again who we are real. We've been around for 6 years. Our mission is driven by the work we do to support city leaders, and how do we strengthen your knowledge and your capacity to understand the role you play in eliminating racial disparities, healing racial divisions, and building more equitable communities. And so we're driven by this big vision that we can become a nation where every local official is equipped to effectively lead and serve inclusive, thriving, healthy communities. And we define inclusive, thriving, healthy communities as safe places where people from all racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds can thrive. They can thrive socially, economically, academically, physically, creating that space for all groups in our cities. And so our network continues to grow. Just as a reminder, this is kind of where we were at the end of 2019. And particularly in the last year, the work has increased exponentially in over 500 cities, towns, and villages, working with now over 20 state municipal leagues across the country, and nearly close to 1,000 city leaders across the country. So the work and the foundation continues to build, but also want to be very clear, even as we lean in today, we do not look to one city to say, here's how a city has solved racism, right? Every city is on their journey, right? There's no one city that has figured this out. So just acknowledging that as you're leaning in, that while it's great to see so many more cities engaged in the space, there isn't a model of perfection, right, that's out there, right? It's everyone is really on their journey, and as Temecula is engaged in this work, just acknowledging the journey and the space that you're in. And then finally, we, as I mentioned at the beginning of our objectives, just want to remind you of our framework. When we do this work, how important it is that we have some framework to guide the work. Again, it's not necessarily here's the solution, but if you're committed to doing this work, realizing this framework really serves as a guide. What's the work that you as a city are doing to normalize a conversation on race and racial equity? And so we're going to spend some more time in that space today. When we were together the last time, we did a little bit of that, and we're going to build on that and create more space for that and some discussion. So that normalizing is really important. But even as you normalize, what's the work you start to do is you start getting comfortable talking about race, how then you start learning how to use tools as a council, as staff. What does that look like as you're starting to look at policies and your practices, your procedures, which we call the 3 Ps? Like, what's the work that needs to be done to apply those tools? And that's the operationalizing side of our work. And then the third is organizing. What does it look like to get organized? Even as the city of Temecula is starting to get organized already with the creation of READY, thinking about what that organizing looks like, even within on council. And so what's the organizing work that works towards developing plans and goals, racial equity plans and racial equity goals that you're setting, and how does that align across the city? And so that organizing work is also a really important part of getting organized and being accountable. So we're not going to do all three of these today, but we're going to just wanted to remind you that that really serves as a foundation to the work and the journey that I was mentioning earlier. But where we want to start today is really building on this normalizing space, and in that we want to introduce to you a video that we might have given you clippets of the last time, but we actually want to bring it into the space for longer space for discussion. And so this is it's a 3-part series, if you may have remembered me mentioning it earlier, done by put out several years ago by PBS. And so wanting to share we're going to break this up into 2 segments. The first part will be about 20 minutes of the video, and then we're going to pause and have a discussion. It really just talks about history, understanding our history of race, and even how we as a country defined it and how that impacted and drove our decisions. And so want to play the first 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to come back and have a chance for reflections as you're kind of listening with the content. So acknowledging some of this content could be heavy. So even as I play it, just want you to be mindful of that as you're sitting with it and taking it in. So I'll go ahead and play it.
It is all around us. It is an illusion and yet profoundly real. What we perceive as race is one of the first things we notice about each other. Skin, darker or lighter. Eyes, round or almond. Blue, black, brown. Hair, curly, straight, blonde, or dark. And attached to these characteristics is a mosaic of values, assumptions, and historical meanings. Even those of us who claim we don't believe the stereotypes can easily recite them.
The average person on the street thinks that race consists of differences in physical appearance. They also think that from looking at a person's physical appearance, that they can find out or know more subtle things about them. Race is not a level of biological division that we find in anatomically modern humans. There are no subspecies in the human beings that live today.
And that's quite shocking to a lot of individuals. When you look and you think you see race, to be told that no, you don't see race, you just think you see race. That, yeah, it's based on your cultural lens. That's extremely challenging.
Just because race isn't a biological reality doesn't mean it isn't real. Being classified as Asian or Black or Latino has never carried the same advantages in our society as being white.
Race in itself means nothing. The markers of race, skin color, hair texture, the things that we identify as the racial markers mean nothing unless they are given social meaning and unless there's public policy and private actions that act upon those kinds of characteristics. That creates race.
Physical differences don't make race. What makes race are the laws and practices that affect life chances and opportunities based on those differences. If we look carefully, we can see how our institutions and policies have assigned racial identities and reinforced racial inequality throughout the 20th century.
And this is something I think that all immigrant groups experience in one way or another when they come to America, no matter what point in time it is, because they come to a country that has historically always been highly racialized. It's a country where race has its origins in slavery, as well as in the conquest of Native American Indians. So anybody coming from the outside after that point has to fit into this racialized society in some way. And it's not always clear how people are going to fit in right away.
At the start of the 20th century, as millions of immigrants arrived from all over the world, lawmakers and social scientists debated how all of them, including the new European arrivals, would fit into the hierarchy of races already here. They came seeking economic opportunity, freedom, and a future for their families. Of the 23 million newcomers between 1880 and 1920, the vast majority were from Eastern and Southern Europe. Immigrants often work the hardest, poorest paying, and most dangerous jobs, along with the so-called inferior races already here: blacks, Mexicans, and Chinese.
Cities with enormous slums developed as the ugly side of industrialization. Ugly both in terms of the aesthetic of American cities, but also ugly in terms of the solidifying of class differences and class tension. As all of those things became apparent, the immigrant became the symbol for what America might be becoming.
By 1910, 58% of American mining and factory workers were immigrants. Like Mexicans and African Americans, Italians, Slavs, and Jews were often desired as laborers, but also feared, seen as promiscuous, lazy, or stupid. Some saw it as a racial invasion. Charles Davenport, a famous biologist, expressed those fears in 1911. The population of the United States, wrote Davenport, will, on account of the great influx of blood from southeastern Europe, rapidly become darker in pigment, smaller in stature, more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sexual immorality. And the ratio of insanity in the population will rapidly increase.
And this was also a time when scientific race theory began to take off, and people began to look at society and look at groups of people in more racialized terms. So people were perceived as being separate races. So you had kind of a higher order of white races, which were seen as the Nordics, as opposed to what many of the nativists called the lower races of Europe.
There are various groups like the American Breeders Association, the Eugenics Research Association, who not only are doing research on various racial types, in this case, Hebrews, Slavs, Mediterraneans. What we would call now the Caucasian race would break it down to 35 or 37 or 45 races for study. And a lot of the language was beginning to get at the idea that Those differences were actually rooted in reproduction. They were rooted in heritable traits. They were heritable, they were biological, they were immutable.
The more the newcomers were forced into low-paying jobs and diseased tenements, the more these conditions were explained as natural consequences of their innate racial character. Biology was destiny. Which side of the racial divide you found yourself on could be a matter of life or death. Between 1890 and 1920, 2,500 African Americans were lynched in the South. In 1915, Leo Frank, a Jew living in Atlanta, was pulled from jail and hanged by a mob for allegedly killing a white girl. Writing about the lynching, a black journalist wondered, is the Jew a white man?
Some historians have suggested that these new immigrant groups from Europe were in-between peoples. They were in a transitional stage when compared to Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Groups such as Italians or Jews were seen as not being fully white, perhaps. But when compared to African Americans or were compared to Asians, their whiteness became more salient, became more visible.
Could European ethnics become fully white, and thus fully American? By 1910, a new term was entering popular culture to describe the transformation of Europeans. The phrase came from the title of a Broadway play by Israel Zangwill. God, said Zangwill, would melt down the races of Europe into a single pure essence, out of which he would mold Americans.
So when the Irish, when Germans, when Italians were coming and they didn't speak the language, they didn't know the culture, the idea was they will assimilate into Americanhood. They will become American, which in the American tradition has meant white American. But that melting pot never included people of color. Blacks, Chinese, Puerto Ricans, etc. could not melt into the pot. They could be used as wood to produce the fire for the pot, but they could not be used as material to be melted into the pot.
Whiteness was key to citizenship. In 1790, Congress had passed an act declaring that only free white immigrants could become naturalized citizens. After the Civil War, naturalization was extended to persons of African descent as well. But it was the white citizen who had clear access to the vote, sat on juries, was elected to public office, and had better jobs. Whiteness was not simply a matter of skin color. To be white was to gain the full rewards of American citizenship.
In order to be a naturalized citizen in this country, you had to be categorized as white or black. And almost everybody who tried to naturalize, all but I think one case that went to the Supreme Court, all of them were people trying to be categorized as white. So the court had to make decisions about who was white and who was not.
Courts and legislators had long been in the business of conferring racial identities. In the South, to enforce Jim Crow segregation and laws against mixed marriages, courts had to first determine who was black under law.
And here's where it really gets interesting. You got some places, for example, Virginia law defined a black person as a person with 1/16 African ancestry. Now, Florida defined a black person as a person with 1/8 African ancestry. Now, Alabama said, you're black if you got any black ancestry, any African ancestry at all. But you know what this means? You can walk across a state line and literally, legally change race. Now, what does race mean under those circumstances? You give me the power, I can make you any race I want you to be, because it is a social, political construction.
In 1909, American courts had that power. That year, the U.S. Court of Appeals in Massachusetts ruled that Armenians, often classified as Asiatic Turks, were legally white. If Armenians could be designated white, what of the other so-called Asiatic races? Filipinos, Syrians, the Japanese. Could they also petition successfully to be designated white by the courts and thus become Americans? In 1922, when Japanese businessman Takao Ozawa petitioned the Supreme Court for naturalization, many in the Japanese community believed his was the perfect test case.
Takao Ozawa came from Japan, went to the University of California at Berkeley for a few years, then moved to Hawaii where he had a family, and he applied to become a naturalized citizen in 1915.
My father wrote his own brief and everything, and he was really devoted. He wanted to become an American citizen, and nothing would stop him. He was determined.
Japanese growers in California watched Ozawa's case closely. By 1920, a series of Alien Land Acts prohibited many non-citizens from owning or leasing land. Without a legal designation of whiteness to make them citizens, Japanese immigrants could not have the full protection of American law, no matter how long they lived in the country. In his brief, Ozawa argued that his skin was as white as any so-called Caucasian, if not whiter. But he made a much more important second argument.
But his second argument was that race shouldn't matter for citizenship. What really mattered was a person's beliefs.
My honesty and industriousness are well known among my Japanese and American friends. In name, Benedict Arnold was an American, but at heart he was a traitor. In name, I am not an American, but at heart, I am a true American.
The articles would come out in the paper. I thought, oh, what did he do? You know, I thought only bad things came out in the paper, and I was kind of ashamed, you know, when I was a child. And it was just the way we were brought up. I didn't have any Oriental friends. My neighbors were all Caucasian, and so he was so determined to get us, well, when the time came, to be American citizens.
The Supreme Court ruled that Ozawa could not be a citizen. They said he was not white within the meaning of the statute and therefore not eligible to citizenship. And the court said, well, he's not white because he's not Caucasian, and Caucasians are whites. He did everything right. He learned English. He had a lifestyle that was American. He went to Christian church on Sunday. He dressed as a Westerner. He brought up his children as Americans. He did everything he was supposed to do. And yet he's told that he can't be a citizen because he's not white.
The court ruled that according to the best-known science, Ozawa was not Caucasian, but of the Mongolian race. But the court would not be bound by science in policing the boundaries of whiteness. Only 3 months after Ozawa, the court took up the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, a South Asian immigrant and U.S. Army veteran who petitioned for citizenship on the grounds that Indians were of the Aryan or Caucasian race, and therefore white.
And he makes the scientific argument, having learned something actually from the Ozawa case, that he is Caucasian. He gets scientific authority to speak on his behalf, that in fact South Asians are included in the Caucasian race.
So here the court was in a bind because they were presented with so-called scientific evidence that Indians were Caucasian. And the court solved this problem by saying that it didn't matter what science said, so-called science. They actually said white is not something that can be scientifically determined, but white is something that is subjectively understood by who they called the common person, the common man.
It may be true, reasoned the court, that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity. But the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today. The same court that used science to determine whiteness in Ozawa 3 months before now refuted its own reasoning in Thind. Thind might well be Caucasian, the High Court said, but he was not white. The justices never said what whiteness was, only what it wasn't. Their implied logic was a circular one. Whiteness was what the common white man said it was.
The court often decided who was white and who wasn't based on whether they just felt that the person would politically fit well into the kind of society that we were trying to build. And sometimes it was pretty explicit that this is what the court was doing.
There was widespread racial views that Asians were undesirable, that they threatened to contaminate the American society. Basically that Asians are too different, that they can never really become like the rest of us.
The consequences of the unanimous verdict in U.S. versus Thind were catastrophic for the Indian community. South Asians who had naturalized before the verdict were stripped of their citizenship and property. Vaishno Das Begai was a successful merchant who fled British tyranny in India to raise his family in a free country. After his American citizenship was revoked, he took his own life. He left a suicide note for his family and another for the public. But now they come and say to me I am no longer an American citizen. What have I made of myself and my children? We cannot exercise our rights. We cannot leave this country. Humility and insults, blockades this way, and bridges burned behind. For the Japanese community, the verdicts in the Ozawa and Thind cases were equally devastating. Now, as aliens ineligible for citizenship, many growers were unable to purchase or even lease land to stay in business. Thousands of acres were seized from Japanese immigrants and sold to white farmers. By the time the racial requirement for naturalization was finally removed in 1952, Takao Ozawa was long dead.
The notion that Asians are racially unassimilable and that they're ineligible to citizenship because of their race is something that I think has had a real enduring effect. The fact that they were seen as non-American enabled many Americans to see them as the enemy and to strip them totally of their civil liberties and to put them in internment camps during World War II. The legacy of this idea is that even those who are third or fourth generation Asian Americans are still perceived as foreigners.
In 1924, Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which effectively banned Asian immigration until 1965. Johnson-Reed also cut immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe to a trickle.
Your blood's the same as mine. Mine's the same as his. Do you know what this wonderful country is made of? It's made up of...
World War II found the U.S. at war with Nazi Germany and Japan. Films like the 1945 Oscar-winning short, The House I Live In, called for national unity and ethnic tolerance.
What is America to me? A name.
And these other distinctions which had carried so much power in an earlier period, Celt, Slav, Anglo-Saxon, started to fade away. They had no purchase because those distinctions didn't seem to hold the key to any social questions that were worth answering anymore. The more important and more pressing political social questions seemed to hinge on black and white.
All races and religions. That's
Sinatra's song was one of tolerance, but the line that sang of "my neighbors black and white" was cut from the film.
So long, man.
European immigrants were learning that whiteness was more than skin color. It was the privilege of opportunity, and above all, exclusive.
There's this whole very standard narrative of the European mobility model. We came here with nothing, we worked hard, we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. And it's offered up as proof of the openness of the American economic order.
Left out of the bootstrap myth of European ethnics was access to opportunities closed to non-whites. Roosevelt's New Deal reforms offered many Americans a path out of poverty.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 50 million of our citizens.
But the original Social Security program excluded farm workers and domestics, most of whom were non-white. And many unions locked blacks and Mexicans into low-paying jobs, or kept them out altogether. But perhaps the best example of how European ethnics would finally gain the full benefits of whiteness came with an innovation in housing at the end of World War II.
Okay, we're going to pause there, come back into space. Just also wanting to acknowledge, as I said, there's a lot obviously to take in, a lot of information to sit with, and particularly if you're hearing and seeing this for the first time, just wanting to acknowledge that, as we're leaning in and kind of reflecting. So just want you to be mindful of that as you're sitting with it, take some deep breaths as you are kind of sitting and sitting with it, and wanting to just kind of pause initially as you are kind of taking in the content. Like if you're pausing and thinking like, what's the lasting impression that you have after watching those first 20 minutes or so of describing a lot of history and context many of us were not taught in schools. And so I'm kind of curious, if there was one word, I'm not going to ask you to defend your word right now, but I'm kind of curious to bring your one word into the space, because you might still need some moments to pause and process. Think about what one word's on your mind. And again, don't feel like you need to defend it. I just want you to name your word as you're sitting with it. And since it's a small group of us, I can just have each of you just unmute yourselves and just share with me your word. So why don't I start with you, Mayor, and then I'll work my way across the screen.
So is this a positive word, or is this a word that I have in my mind because of the first segment that we've seen?
Or the latter, as you've reflected,
okay.
This is the word that you're sitting with right now.
Well, stupidity would be my first choice, but I'm going to say exclusion.
Exclusion, okay, appreciate that. Matt, how about you?
I think my word would be re-education.
Okay, that's great. And Stu?
My word would be unknown. Like you were just saying about, you weren't educated about this when you were in school. This is like a completely first time I heard of any of this.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing that. And what about you, Zach?
I think the word that comes to mind to me is calculated.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I appreciate each of you sharing. And again, I think we want you to, I'm glad also that as you shared your words, and we've done these versions of trainings and literally across the country, and many times in spaces, also know sometimes the words that I hear, particularly from some of the white participants in our training, is shame or guilt. And I usually caution, and this name when I hear the shame or guilt, like the goal of us sharing this with you is not to produce that, right? It's not for you to feel like you should feel shame or guilt as a white person. You feel like I should have known. No, this was intentional for you not to know, right? And so it's not to feel like you should beat yourself up to say like I should have known. No, it was designed for you not to know, right? And so the guilt and shame piece is one that we, while that might be a feeling, just want to just acknowledge that the goal here is not for you to go down that road, right? As you're sitting with this, but thinking much more about what can you do as you sit with this space and trying to process that history, and what does it mean to sit with it as you think about the fact that we didn't know this, and we didn't know this, and now you are becoming more aware how to process that. And so I'm curious, in the video, there are a couple of things that what this first part of the video did that I thought was, I thought was helpful to kind of define, right, as they define race. One, it was how they define what Black was. You guys remember where they talked about that, where they defined about Black? Do one of you remember how we ended up defining what Black was? What the takeaway was there?
Yeah, it's a social issue. It's not, they aren't determining it by even scientific terms,
right,
or medical terms. It's the beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So yeah, absolutely. Right. So it was social. Right. And so so do you remember as they defined it socially, how did we end up defining? Did we come up with one definition of how we define what Black was?
No, it reminded me of over the years that sort of made reference in the opinions to the, I know it when I see it, sort of philosophy, right?
Yep.
And without that clear guidance or definition, that's just yet another example of how, policy or law was crafted to, be intentionally vague.
Yeah.
But yeah, bigotry still existed. I mean, it was pervasive.
Yeah. Well, and it was, I like that word. It was very arbitrary, right? So
yes,
if you remember, in one state, I think they said Virginia defined Black as if you were 1/8, if you had a 1/8 African ancestry, and then South Carolina, maybe I got them reversed. I think South Carolina said if you had 1/16 African African ancestry, and Alabama said if you had any African ancestry, you were Black. So literally, it's like you could cross the state. And so if you went from 1/8 or to 1/16, you could move from being Black to not Black, or defined white. So literally it wasn't a kind of a universal standard. Every state defined it for what it was. But yet it was still being defined, right? We were still defining what it was and giving meaning behind it as we were defining what it was, right? And similarly, what I thought that the first part of the video did was try to define what white was. And that literally went to the Supreme Court, right? As they realized that defining white added value. If you were defined as white meant something in terms of what it meant to be defined as white. And curious your thoughts about that. Do you feel like courts, that the courts were wrong for doing that? Like they shouldn't have defined it? Or what's your feeling about that?
Well, I think constitutionally they shouldn't have defined it. I mean, everyone should have equal rights and equal justice and equal consideration. And bigotry in any sense of the word shouldn't be tolerated. And they're giving you an excuse to have racism, and they're giving you an excuse to be a racist or a bigot.
Well, and I got the impression that the reasoning was to become an American, for that Japanese guy to become an American, which is so ironic that, we've got people who are in this country that really doesn't want to be an American, but he really, really wanted to be an American and he couldn't. And that's kind of like the moment when I was scratching my head going, why are you trying to keep him out? What's the reasoning behind that? Because he's white or not white, or that was the scratching head moment. I just couldn't understand that.
Well,
and how the
especially
Supreme Court supported that.
When all the documents, the Bill of Rights said, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Well, inalienable rights are the rights that you're born with, that you assume that you have: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the right to breathe. I mean, anytime I know this happened, and I'm horrified by it. And anytime I see, videos like this, and I know it's all true and it's horrible, I just shake my head and say, how could they do this? And I know they did, and I know it still exists in places. But I'm still saying, how could this happen? To me, it seems so clear that it's just wrong in every sense of the word.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate you, Mayor, saying I don't remember if we did this the last time we were together, but you mentioned the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, with life, liberty, and the pursuit of all men are created equal. And we do this exercise, and I can't remember if we did it with you guys, about values that we've espoused as a country versus our reality. And I can't remember if we did it with you, but when we say when all men were created equal, we know it was Declaration of Independence. You all remember who wrote that? It was Thomas Jefferson, right?
Thomas Jefferson, et al.
1776, right? And
Yeah.
so the value sounds wonderful, right? All men
He
are
had slaves. He had slaves.
He had slaves. He wasn't talking about all men. He was talking about white men who owned property. It wasn't talking about women, right?
Whoa.
And so, right. So it's like we have a lot of values that sound wonderful, but haven't always reflected our reality, right? As we think about what the reality was then, or even as we think about reality now, right? So it's important to sit with that too, right? As we understand. That's part of our history, right? As we're sitting with that.
You know what else I think is bad, Leon, is that when you say, how Americans, treat ethnicities, do we practice those values? Do we, as a country? That angers me too, because I don't feel that way. I mean, I think it's wrong. I think it's horrible, and I've spoken out about it. And so when I'm lumped in with all the people that are perceived to believe that way, I don't like it.
Yeah. Well, and I think I appreciate you saying that, Mayor, and I think in all the work that we've been doing across the country, I think most people, there's never a group that we've been in where people don't feel strongly about the unfairness of it, right? And I think people's desire is to want to be fair.
Yeah.
Right? As you do the work, as we think about sitting with this in context of understanding history and what it means to be fair. So I think naming that is important, but also sitting with it. Let's say you were in a position where one of us had to define what white was, right? And as the courts were doing it, right? It wasn't as if we don't see race, right? We all acknowledge we see color, right? It's not like we don't see color, right? We see, and so you were forced in a society to say, well, tell me then, if you see color, you call yourself white, or you call yourself black. If you're calling yourself white, how do you define what white is? And if you were forced to do that, like the courts were being forced to do it in the early 1900s, and someone asked you to put language behind it, what would you say? I mean, I pose it that way because it's easy to kind of critique the court, right? To say like they should have better defined it, right? Because they were being asked to define it. It was coming before them as a court. And so that they were being asked now to define it. Like, what if that was us? And someone asks you, like, even now today, as you define what white is, what is white?
Who is white is the question. I mean, based on our ethnicity, we're such a melting pot in the United States. I don't know if you can actually define white anymore.
And well, see, there's the challenge, right? So there's the challenge because it's not as if we don't see white. Our brains still process because we've given meaning to the construct. Like, and so one of our facilitators likes to say, race is 100%, 100% has no meaning, and it's 100% consequential at the same time. Like we've done both.
I get that.
It's like we've done both. We've given meaning to it. So it's not, you can't say, you can't ignore that. Like it's all of us are still processing it as a person. But then if someone was coming to say, define it, then okay, because I can tell you personally, I used to define white as Caucasian.
Yeah.
And then I saw this video, and I saw the case with that with the Japanese grower, and he, not the Jap, it was thin. It was not Ozawa, but it was a thin case, and it was in the thin case where the courts then said no, it's not a Caucasian. It's like it's not science. It's not Caucasian. It's like what the common white man says white is. So I was like, okay, so I guess it's not Caucasian. But that's how we used to, I used to interchange people. Many people still say Caucasian or white, Caucasian or white. Right?
I think it's by perception now. I think people judge other people if they have those racist tendencies. I think they judge other people by what they perceive to be the race of that person. You know, and I think it's done by, you know, your color. If you're looking at somebody or other ethnic traits that you might have, you know, shape of your face or, you know, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Right, so there's something that I appreciate you saying that, Mayor, because right, you're trying to acknowledge like there's something our brains are doing, right?
Yes.
And you're and you're trying to kind of acknowledge like our brains are doing something, right? It's looking at color, it's looking at features, and then when it finds itself confused, it's like, what? I'm not exactly sure. Is this person? And your brain starts to then become more conscious of what you were doing unconsciously, like as you just quickly make assumptions. But I appreciate you kind of just calling that out because there's probably a lot of what's happening.
Do most people do that because they want to discriminate? Or do people do, I mean, it's a natural, I hear you saying it's a natural thing to do, but then what do you do with it?
Great question. It's a great question.
Yeah, that's the determining factor. What do you do with it?
That's right. And we touched upon this a little bit the last time when we were together as we talk about our bias. We all have it. We all have it among not just race, whether you're talking about if you're tall versus short, if you're bald versus if you have hair, if you wear glasses, if you don't, if you wear a tourniquet or if you don't, or if you're in a wheelchair with a disability or if you don't, our brains are processing this all the time, right? And we're giving meaning to it. And so the work is being mindful that your brains are doing that and understanding, are you making assumptions about groups based upon stereotypes or information you've taken in? And how are you doing the work to kind of checking yourself on some of the assumptions that you've made? And many times you're making those assumptions unconsciously, as we talk about how our brains work, right? So you're absolutely right naming that. And then the question is, what's the work that I need to be doing to become more conscious of the things that where I'm making assumptions? Yeah. Let me just check in with Jordan and Jillian before we kind of get to the second part. Just, I mean, you guys have been listening, and any reactions or reflections you wanted to share in the space?
I have another observation. Even this video has left out a group of the, a segment of the population that is probably the most populous segment of the population, and everyone will experience this at some time or another, and that is senior citizens. And if you think senior citizens aren't discriminated against, you're wrong. They are. All we have to do is point to New York. And now they're saying 44,000 seniors died in nursing homes, in New York. It's horrific. So seniors, of course, there were seniors who were slaves, but they weren't enslaved because they were seniors. So we're all going to be there someday. So I just would caution everybody to think, when you say senior citizen, what's the image that you have? Somebody that can't get a job anymore because they're perceived to be too old, someone who doesn't qualify for a driver's license, someone you see walking on the street in the afternoon and you stop and say, "Are you okay?" Because he looks like he's lost, even though he's, listening to his iPhone or something. It happens all the time, but yet nobody's talking about that. Is it because it happens just as a matter of course?
Well, so I appreciate you acknowledge. So there's a lot to unpack there, right? As we talk about understanding who's been impacted worse, I think,
no question about that.
And as we think about, even as what I appreciate you naming is really looking at it specifically with COVID and the impacts of COVID and coronavirus, and I think we talked about this again the last time, but just reinforcing the point. While we know race is the strongest predictor of one's success, it's not race or other issues, right? It's understanding race and, right? And I think what you're calling out is exactly the point, right? As we know from the data, while we know that Hispanic and Latin communities were contracting coronavirus at significantly higher rates than any other group, and that Black and Indigenous were dying significantly at a higher rate, when you looked at it even more deep, more granular, you realize it was not just the Black as an aggregate, yes, but if you look where was impacting more, we're talking about our Black and Indigenous seniors, right?
Yeah.
And seeing like how they were being impacted significantly. So what you're naming is acknowledging the importance of understanding this term that we call intersectionality, understanding the intersections between, I didn't come up with the term. Kimberly Crenshaw came up with the term intersectionality of understanding how this connects, things are connected to one another, and understanding the compound inequities. So I think what you're naming is right on point to be able to hold both as you're understanding the impacts. And let me
We're all going to get there. If we're lucky, we're all going to get there. We're all going to be senior citizens.
God willing. Yeah. Let me check with Matt and Zach. I don't know if you're in contemplative mode, and wanted to make sure we're hearing your voices too, and wanted to make sure we're giving you space as well.
Yeah. So thanks for acknowledging us in there. I'm trying to just really soak all this in and really listen to my colleagues. The one thing that I sort of take from a lot of this is, like, when we talk about defining things, is it's adding or taking away value in sort of this capitalistic society that we live in. You're either given value or taken value away, and sort of, should the courts have to decide that? You sort of look at that slide as you pan across the Supreme Court, and you go, well, of course they defined it the way they defined it. Look who was defining it, right? But my brain, and I'm glad that you brought this up, because even as I just look at this screen, my brain is trying to make and process things, just looking in these individual squares just constantly, and thinking about just everyone's background and their personal experiences and some of our shared experiences, and just trying to move through this space. And part of it for me is to just have these conversations, but just really just sort of soak it in and acknowledge this history. And why I used the word that I used, calculated, is it does feel like, and it truly is, it's calculated. The educational system that we get, the things that we learn, it's really only now where you're starting to learn things. And as an almost 50-year-old adult, I'm still constantly learning new things and thinking, gosh, why didn't I learn about that when I was in high school? Why didn't I learn about that? Why did it take me so long to learn some of these things? And so that's why I use that word, calculated. Is just, there's a reason behind, and again, sort of adding value to people's lives and giving them full access, or taking value away and limiting their access to full participation in our society.
Those are great. Thank you for sharing those thoughts and bringing that into the space. Appreciated what you had to offer there. And what about you, Matt? How are you sitting with this?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if we've talked about my background, but I spent a lot of time in research and education, and actually spend a lot of time teaching coursework and how to do research to our students and others, and statistics and all that. And you mentioned it earlier. One of the things that I try and always emphasize with folks is that our eye is really good at identifying patterns, right? So, and almost as good, if not in some cases even better, than computers, right? So I always tell folks, hey, look, if you want to take a look at the data, graph it out, look at the pattern visually, what are you seeing, right? And what kind of relationships are there? And so we try and teach our students, how to think like, that sort of statistical, scientific kind of mind. And as we're watching these videos and talking about race, you ask the question, how do you define white or black or whatever it is? And it's funny because if I were teaching this course in, say, the context of statistics, the first question I would be asking is, why do you want to define that? Right? Not just how, but why are you doing it in the first place? Like, what's the purpose of creating that category that you're trying to pull out of all of the data and say, this is what we're calling white, right? So what is that purpose behind it? Because, one of the other things I always bring into my classes is this great book I have. It's a little paperback and it's entitled How to Lie with Statistics. And it's, it's a whole book on, all of the ways that you can, manipulate numbers and graphics and things to tell whatever kind of story you want to tell. And so it always gets back to that question of why. So why are we trying to define a race or a population? And is there an objective to doing that? And we also deal with bias in the sciences as well, right? You're going in because you're doing research on cancer risk in firefighters, right? And your assumption is firefighters have a higher risk of cancer. So you're intentionally looking for those patterns of information. You're not looking at it objectively anymore necessarily, right? And the patterns are probably there. You're probably right on track because you're a good scientist. But, again, you have this bias in the back of your mind. And this is why we go through this whole sort of iterative peer review process, because somebody else could look at the same data and say, oh, I'm not seeing what you're seeing, right? But we have this sort of implicit bias in our mind of what we're trying to look for. And so I kind of, that's how my mind's working in all of this, as I see, these patterns in this discussion. And I always just go back to, why are we doing this in the first place? What was the objective? Because certainly if you go back into our deeper history on Declaration of Independence or anything, there were folks writing, their own articles and their own contemplations on slavery and race and equity and diversity at that time. They just weren't necessarily the dominant voice or the politically, responsible voice at that time. So their voice kind of, those articles and things exist, but they didn't drive, the direction of the country at that time. So anyway, so that's kind of where my mind's at.
I appreciate the analytical perspective of it and bringing that into the space as well in terms of what you have to offer. And I'm curious though too, if you've gone further in that question of why are we defining race, if you have some thoughts about that, and curious if you wanted to bring that into the space.
Well, I do, because, like today, if we were to ask, how do we define a population or what Marianne said, even, how do we define senior citizens? Again, the question is why? Are we trying to provide services and support? Are we trying to, identify, a community of need and provide services? Or, are we, in some way introducing another level of bias into that conversation and categorizing folks to kind of keep everybody in their box, right? And again, that's the why. And I think that's, again, when we talked about creating the READY Commission and moving forward with some of the objectives in our own city, that was a big part of our discussion. Like, why are we doing this? Why do we need a commission like this? And why are we using the words we're using? And we even defined what race and equity, diversity, inclusion meant, so that everybody was aware of why we were using those words. But the why for me, and I've talked a lot about this with Randy and Aaron Kevin and others over the last year or so. The why for me is more of just sort of a human component, right? And you can extract, I mean, look, what we're doing here has a lot of political overtones, right? And there's a segment of our community that, is they're proud of what we're doing and very supportive. And then there are those that aren't necessarily comfortable with this, and maybe those that even oppose the entire concept itself. And so, how do you, again, when we talk about the why, how do you get that answer out there? And just say, well, why is because we're all human beings, right? It is just simply the human thing to do to want everybody to be healthy and successful and prosperous, right? Shouldn't that be our objective? And if it's anything less than that, then what's our underlying reason why? And a lot of it comes from misunderstanding and fear, and a lot of places of fear of change, and you see that very strongly right now in the country. And so, part of, I think, why I'm so happy that we're normalizing this conversation now is to strip away a lot of the politics and the fear and the concern, and just get down to, the basics of what it means to be a human on this planet and live with one another.
I don't think I could have said that one any better. That was good. I appreciate just acknowledging the why from a humanity standpoint, to see each other as humans, as a foundation. And what does it take to be able, if we all want to be able to see everyone succeed, what's the work that we need to do to get there? And that's I think a wonderful way of kind of acknowledging the foundational why to it. So thanks for bringing that analytical mind into the space that I think complements well, I think, the other reflections that others are sharing. I know we want to show the second part of the video, but let me just check in with my co-facilitators. They've been listening carefully. I just want to create space before I share the second part to see if either one of them have reflections or things that you're hearing that you wanted to make sure we followed up on before moving forward. Jordan or Jillian?
No, I really appreciate everybody's offerings and reflections in this space. And I think what I'm most sitting with is, again, that shift from the how to the why that Matt brought in, as well as Zach, your offerings around calculated, and using that to then kind of, from what I heard from Mayor as well as Stu, in terms of kind of the reflections that you all were sitting with, of not knowing this previously, and again, back to Matt, why you're not knowing this before we introduce this content today. So really appreciate this foundation as we move through today.
Yeah, I echo the appreciation, and as one of the co-facilitators, and the co-facilitator who identifies as a white person, it feels really important to have this collective foundation, this normalizing of language, so that we can become aware, so then we can sit with it, right, and really take the time to analyze it, so that our actions don't continue to perpetuate it, right? And I think about just wanting to just that piece that we never actually define what white is, just what it isn't, right? And the purpose of that why is about excluding people from whiteness and protecting the advantage and the way of being for a select few. And I just think that's a super important piece to sit with and acknowledge, and just name as a white person on this journey with all of you.
Thank you, Jordan and Jillian, for what you've offered. And so we'd like to share part two of this docuseries. This pivots more to looking more at the impacts of policy. And so we'll sit more with that. And again, it's a lot to take in, and we'll come back and have space for reflection.
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
living space was at a premium. When in the Bronx, they tried building Quonset huts, and they turned to slums. All the Quonset huts had just disintegrated. There were two families sharing a hut. One family at one end, one family at the other, and before you know it, they were awful.
FHA came to the rescue by ensuring long-term, low monthly payment mortgage loans.
Veterans needed homes for families. They turned to a revolutionary New Deal housing program. It would racialize housing, wealth, and opportunity for decades in ways few could have imagined.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans, or the backing for loans, to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Due to the stimulation of the National Housing Act, from every section of the country come reports of vastly...
In order to purchase a house in America prior to 1930s, you had to pay 50% of the sales price up front. The new terms of purchasing a home was that you put 10% or 20% down, and the bank financed 80% of it, not over 5 years, but over 30 years at relatively low rates. This opened up the opportunities for Americans to own homes like ever before. The average person could own that home.
If these terms sound familiar, they should, because this is essentially the same financing scheme that allows most Americans to own their homes today. Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. On the outskirts of Baltimore, Memphis, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, and other cities, brand new communities sprang up. One of the most famous was a Long Island potato field, transformed into 17,000 new homes. It was called Levittown. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
You have to remember the people who came here in 1947, 1948 were young ex-GIs whose uppermost concern was taking advantage of the GI Bill and making things better for themselves.
Before moving to Levittown, Herb Callisman and his wife Doris lived in a cramped attic apartment in New York City.
And when we began to look for an apartment, we found that the apartments were $100, $125, $150 a month. I know that's unbelievable today, but it was too expensive for us. And out here in Levittown, the mortgage payments was $65 a month.
Your kitchen dazzles every eye. A brand new sink, a built-in oven, a new refrigerator, and a...
If you were buying a Levitt home in 1947, 48, 49, 50, and 51, you would get, this would be your kitchen. You would get a GE stove, GE refrigerator, and a Bendix wash machine. It would be part of the real estate.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
It was as though it wasn't real. You can't imagine. But for someone to come out and actually tell you that they can't sell to you, you know, I was really on an up. Man, look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin, I can't be a part of it.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something deadly wrong there.
I think we had the golden chance after World War II, and we flubbed it, because here we had a GI Bill that was that was available to everybody, but in a way they didn't make it available to everybody, and that was a golden opportunity in this country, and we missed it. We really missed it.
You can always tell, can't you? A town with good real estate people is a more substantial community because more people own their own homes. That's right.
And now it's sort of hard to believe that the federal government nationalized and introduced redlining. In a funny way, it wasn't just giving something to whites, it was constructing whiteness. Whiteness meant, as in the past whites had meant being a citizen and being a Christian, it now meant living in the suburbs.
Only 50 years before, European ethnics were believed to be distinct races. Now, in these new segregated neighborhoods, they blended together as white Americans.
We did have different religious groups. We were mixed up there, but we were an all-white community, and I think it's an unrealistic world. I think there's something sterile about everyone being on the same economic level and everyone being the same color.
It certainly doesn't promote a feeling of a wider world, wider, not whiter, to live in a place where there are only people that look like you.
Cartoonist Bill Griffith remembers moving from Brooklyn to Levittown as a kid.
It's an untenable artificial world. You're creating a weird utopia in a way, a utopia of middle-class white people who were trying to deny that they were living in a multi-racial world. And how long can you keep that up? You can't keep that up forever. Whether there were going to be black people in Levittown was just, it would be almost the equivalent of saying, are there going to be Martians in Levittown?
Basically, the idea of whiteness is who's included, who's part of the family, and it has material consequences. Blacks weren't completely left out of the housing market. The housing market that they were exposed to was largely public housing. And public housing, first of all, was built almost exclusively, with a few exceptions, in the central city. And after World War II, we started building these larger and larger public housing projects, which were called vertical ghettos. All of a sudden, you're concentrating large numbers of poor people of color in one place.
Another federal program, urban renewal, was supposed to make cities more livable. 90% of all housing destroyed by urban renewal was not replaced. 2/3 of those displaced were Black or Latino.
Fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
In 1968, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. For the first time, racial language was removed from federal housing policy. Non-white families began moving into traditionally white communities in numbers.
We lived in an apartment, a two-family house in Queens, and when we came here, it was the first time we had bought a house, and I was looking for everything in the storybooks.
The Frisbees moved from Queens to suburban Roosevelt, only a few miles from Levittown. Like the Frisbees, many non-white families would discover the economic value of race in the real estate market. They watched as their homes and neighborhoods in suburbia declined precisely because they had moved into them.
When I moved into a neighborhood, I thought it would stay intact the way it was. On the street that I moved on when I moved there, it was predominantly white. Within 2 years, it was predominantly black.
It was called blockbusting. Real estate agents preyed on the racial fears of white homeowners to get them to sell their homes quickly for less than market value. The homes were resold to non-whites at inflated prices.
Well, they would say, you know, we're having black people move in. Now, I will give you cash if you want to sell me your house. Do you want to stay with black people next door to you? And that's the way it went on. And as Bunny said, a lot of the people just said, yes, I'll take the money and run. And that's the start of the white people leaving.
As more Black and Latino families moved to Roosevelt, real estate became more and more depressed, just as the FHA had predicted. But why?
I have an idea my house is probably worth around 120 in this town. But what it would be worth in Wantor or Garden City or some other place, probably around 200,000 or better. Now you're talking about 80,000. You said to me one time about why do people dislike the blacks? Well, money-wise, there's a reason. Not that you dislike the blacks so much, but you dislike what happens when a community turns from white to black.
It wasn't African Americans moving in that caused housing values to go down in Roosevelt and other neighborhoods. It was whites leaving.
When a neighborhood, a previously white neighborhood, starts to integrate, even if individual whites don't have personal or psychological animosity or racial hatred, they still have an economic incentive to leave because they recognize that others might make the same calculation and leave first. So you get a vicious circle where whites calculate that other whites are going to sell when a neighborhood integrates, therefore they want to sell first to avoid losses, and they actually make it happen. They make white flight happen.
And if you think about African Americans, if African Americans are 20% of that market, it means that 80% of the people are not looking in those places for homes. So the prices of those homes declines or stays stable. And banks contribute to this by continually making loans in regions that are on the rise, white communities, and making it difficult to get loans in black communities.
So there's a difference. There's a lack of symmetry that's important to keep in mind. So it's not the same when whites are all by themselves, because when they're all by themselves, they're taking all the resources with them. They're taking all the amenities with them. But when blacks are by themselves, they can't get loans. They don't have a decent tax base. There are no jobs, and then that becomes associated with black space.
In the end, what happened to Roosevelt happens in many neighborhoods when white families and businesses flee. The tax base eroded. Schools and services declined. The town was seen by county officials as a legitimate dumping ground for welfare families.
At one point, we had explicit laws that says whites are on top and blacks are on the bottom. Today, we have many of the same practices without the explicit language. And those practices are largely inscribed in geography. And so geography does the work of Jim Crow laws. So many people are confused as why after 50 years of civil rights are our schools still segregated? Why are our housing markets still segregated? Why are our jobs still segregated? And again, a lot of this is a function of how we've reinscribed the racial geographic space in the United States. That structure is still what we're living with today.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for their next generation.
So if you can get a government loan and with your GI Bill, your newly earned college degree, and buy a house in an all-white area that then appreciates in value, that then you can pass on to your children, then you're passing on wealth that has all been made more available to you as a consequence of racist policies and practices. To the child of that parent, it looks like my father worked hard, bought a house, passed his wealth on to me, made it possible for me to go to school, mortgage that house so I could have, you know, a relatively debt-free college experience and finance my college education. How come your father didn't do that? You know, well, there's some good reasons why maybe your father had a harder time doing it if you're African American or Latino or Native American.
And the thing that's really slick about whiteness, if you will, is that most of the benefits can be obtained without ever doing anything personally. For whites, they're getting the spoils of a racist system, even if they're not personally racist.
To glimpse one of the far-reaching consequences of racial inequality, you need only consider one statistic: comparative net worth or wealth. If you add up everything you own and subtract all your debts, what's left is your net worth.
Today, the average black family has only 1/8 the net worth or assets of the average white family. That difference has seemingly grown since the 1960s, since the civil rights triumphs, and is not explained by other factors like education, earnings rates, savings rates. It is really the legacy of racial inequality from generations past. No other measure captures the legacy, the sort of cumulative disadvantage of race, or cumulative advantage of race for whites, than net worth or wealth.
Even with the same income, white families have on average twice the wealth of black families. Much of that difference lies in the value of their homes. But what happens when we compare families along the color line who have similar wealth?
When you make the right comparison, when you compare a black kid from a family with the same income and wealth level as the white kid from the similar economic situation, rates of college graduation are the same. Rates of employment and work hours are the same. Rates of welfare usage are the same. So when we're talking about race in terms of a cultural accounting of these differences or a genetic accounting of these differences, we're really missing the picture because we're making the wrong comparison.
We want to be a colorblind society that values the content of character over the color of skin. The hope of thousands of newcomers who arrive each year is that we already are.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic of which
I don't see color. I see people, the saying goes.
There are people from 100 other nations who look different from you. People whose religion, history, skin color, and reason for being here today may be different from yours.
But in post-civil rights America, is color blindness the same as equality?
The notion of
colorblindness came to us from that famous I Have a Dream speech of Dr. Martin Luther King, where he said that people should be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of the skin. And what has happened in the post-civil rights era is that whites have assumed that we are already there, that we're in a society where color does not matter.
On the one hand, the civil rights era officially ended inequality of opportunity, officially ended de jure legal inequality. At the same time, those civil rights triumphs did nothing to address the underlying economic and social inequalities that had already been in place. It doesn't recognize the fact that the rewards, the house, the Lexus, the big bank account, those are not only the rewards of the pot of gold at the end of the game, they're also the starting position for the next generation.
The wealth gap grows. The advantages of being white accumulate from one generation to the next.
What are the benefits or the advantages to being white in a society that has historically given benefits and advantages to members of the dominant group? And if you are a person who has that privilege, you don't necessarily notice it.
So until we recognize that there's really no way to talk about equality of opportunity without talking about equality of condition, then we're stuck with this paradoxical idea of a colorblind society in a society that's totally unequal by color.
Claiming we don't see race won't end racial inequality. As Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun said, to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way.
And just as we're born into this system, we don't ask to be loaded up with stereotypes or omissions or distortions when we come into the world. We don't ask to be in a structure which is unfair, but that's what we have inherited. Whether you identify as a person of color, whether you identify as a white person, it doesn't matter.
I think we have to be uncomfortable with the present racial arrangement. In a sense, I think we have to be willing to be uncomfortable, willing to demand more of ourselves and more of our country, and willing to make the invisible visible.
I think we all have to think about, what can I influence? I don't influence everything, but the things I do influence, I can think about, how am I making this a more equitable environment? I can ask myself, who's included in this picture and who isn't? Who's had opportunities in my environment and who hasn't? What can I do about that?
All right, come on back. So we know that there is obviously a lot there to take in. Again, some of this could be things that you were familiar with, and others could be you're sitting with it for the first time. I mean, if I was to ask you, how many have heard of redlining before? Just maybe by show of hands, right? Okay, so that's most. That's all of you. And how many do that government played a role in redlining? Okay, so see that not all of you maybe, and so that's a new piece, that like understanding the role the government played, and then how many? And some of you you might have seen this before, but how many have learned something new, even like seeing it a second time? Right, and that's important to acknowledge as we talk about our journey. Sitting with this, there's a lot of information to take in. And really it's important to kind of be able to sit with. And so wanted to kind of check in with you there in terms of what you've learned that was new for you as you were sitting with it. This was your first time seeing it, maybe just kind of reflect there. But if it was, you knew this, but there were some new insights that you gained from it, would love to kind of hear where each of you are around kind of the new parts of what you expanded in your understanding?
Well, I'll start.
Go ahead, Stu.
All right, so I was a child in the 60s and a teenager in the 70s. So I really just learned about redlining probably this last year, period. And I always thought it was realtors kind of grouping these redlining into race and cultural differences. I didn't really realize that the federal government was funding certain races and not certain races. So that was kind of new to me. But I grew up, like I said, when I was a teenager in the 70s. I saw a lot of just what the video showed was a very heavy Hispanic area, very heavy Black area, and I grew up in an all-white area. I mean, literally, my whole school was white. Elementary, junior high, and in high school we got one Black family, and that's it. So, you know, I grew up basically just in that utopia that they said, you know, that like you said, the bubble burst eventually. But for me personally, it probably didn't burst until the 80s, you know, that I really saw the racial integration of, you know, my life in particular. So, but yeah, so that was new to me as the redlining. I always thought it was, well, and like I said, I literally just learned about it a year ago. But I always thought it was just realtors basically steering potential buyers into, no, you want to be in this neighborhood, or you don't want to be in this neighborhood, you want to go to this neighborhood. So that was my version of redlining, you know, a year ago.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And again, in the space of not knowing, it's a lot of this was intentionally designed for you not to know, like that there was, you know, that these neighborhoods were not designed by accident, right? And I remember, I think it was last week, I was in a training with some local elected officials from across the state of Indiana, and it was predominantly white group of leaders, and one of the electeds, it might have been the mayor from a small town, said, like, I grew up where I used to, and it was right outside of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and it just kind of like the video for him was an eye-opening experience of not realizing how intentional these neighborhoods were, where he grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and how there were policies intentionally designed where predominantly Black neighborhood in Fort Wayne was the way it was. And so for him, it was like a light bulb moment. Like he never even paused to sit with it before. And that's part of the point. Like it's a part of it's to acknowledge the intentionality of some of the policies, and then that really starts to pivot to what can we do about it, right? What's the work that we could do as leaders to engage in that space? So I appreciate you sharing that and offering that, Stu. Curious to hear some others. Why don't I go to Zach this time and see, Zach, how are you sitting with this?
Yeah, thank you, Leon. You know, like taking something away from that video, you know, it wasn't the pervasiveness of it or just the systemic nature of it wasn't anything new to me, but the thing that I try to think about and this is something that I've learned fairly recently, is just how sort of that local control, if you will, or those decisions we make at the local level, outside of the financing and those things, but land use in general play into this conversation. And those are things that we can actually control here in this space. And so for me, there was sort of this, you know, aha moment, if you will, because certainly we'd never teach land use in high school or things like that. But coming into this conversation last year and sort of building on that and understanding what it looks like, what concentrated poverty looks like, and why those decisions were made, and a lot of the reasons why, you know, we talk about the why earlier, whether it's power, it's wealth, it's some of the fears and things like that. Those trickle down into this uncomfortable space where, as elected leaders at that local level, we have some of those controls, and those are things I'm trying to wrestle with, just as an elected leader, and trying to balance that community, the entire community, and what does that feel like? What does that look like? For me, just getting uncomfortable with it, but then also getting comfortable with the decisions that we have to make. And I still have to sleep at night. You know, I still have to be comfortable in my body doing what I feel is right and what we feel like the community deserves. And So for me, it was just sort of the one thing that I've taken out of this sort of larger conversation is just that local, that hyper local, the things that happen at the local level truly matter to the people that live in and around your city. So that was just for me where I started thinking a little bit more about some of those decisions we make.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I'm reminded that Temecula as a city is like less than 40 years old, right? As a city, right? So it's while it may not have that long history as a city, there still is a history tied to it, right? Even as you know, we started by acknowledging the land, yes, right, in terms of the indigenous history, right? But there's also understanding the history with the surrounding region that you're in. And while it's only 40 years old, there still is a narrative tied to that. And understanding how that is driven, right? Even as you're sitting with that, I think is important I appreciate you just offering that, Zach, of how you localize it. So thank you for sharing that. And Matt, how is the analytical mind of you processing this?
You know, I'll share a conversation I had with Randy and Kevin and Aaron a little while ago. So there's this quote that is often misquoted and often attributed to the wrong person, but originally it was George Santayana, I believe, that said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," right? And so I came up with this book title, and somebody needs to write this book. And unfortunately, I don't think I've got the time or the writing capabilities maybe, but I think a great book title would be Condemned by Omission, right? If you think about it, you know, and I shared with those folks, and I'll share with you, you know, as a little kid, I remember sitting in our elementary school class, and I remember we had this brown circular sort of braided rug, you know, I remember those old kind that kind of everybody had, you know, back in the 80s, sitting on that thing, listening to our teacher, you know, read these stories to us about Christopher Columbus or the 13 colonies, or, you know, Ponce de Leon. And it was this fascinating history. I mean, really intriguing, all adventurous, and something to really be proud of as a kid, right? And when I said earlier, you know, you know, my word was re-education. Well, it really is, because it turns out Christopher Columbus and the discovery of America wasn't quite what I had learned when I was a kid, right? And so you're relearning all of this stuff now as an adult, saying, hey, you know, look, I understand you want to tell a certain story or a narrative on our country's history and something we should be proud of. But again, going back to that quote of, you know, condemned to repeat it, you know, if we're condemned by omission, if we never actually give our children and the people in this country the opportunity to really understand our history, then, you know, how are we ever going to learn from this? And then even more importantly, I think as an adult, you know, you get a little bit frustrated and frankly kind of pissed, because, you know, it's like, why wasn't this? And Stu, you know, like the redlining thing, you know, it's a great example. Like, how come this is the first time we're hearing about this stuff, you know, and you wonder about it and you say, you know, well, clearly we want to do something better than that. But if we're never given the tools in the first place to do that, then, you know, how do we make that progress? And, you know, how do we avoid making those same mistakes? And so when I say re-education, I think it's important that, you know, we not only think about this as adults and decision makers, but we also think about it for that next generation coming up. And you're seeing it more in the schools and all of that, of a sort of a retelling of our history and a little bit more balanced perspectives, but we're nowhere near, you know, where I think we need to be. Now, I'll say too, I don't think that Mrs. Anderson, when I was in the 4th grade, you know, intentionally tried to, you know, she probably sat on a similar rug being told similar stories and was given a similar, you know, history book to teach to kids, you know, at our age. So this just sort of somehow it perpetuated itself. And so when I put this in the context of decision makers and politicians and, you know, council members or senators or whomever, you know, I like to think that I shouldn't say everybody, that a lot of the decision makers over the last, you know, couple hundred years really did have the best intentions in mind, right? I think I have to think that in some cases, right? Because otherwise it's just too depressing the other way. But let's just assume that for the most part, everybody had, you know, good intentions in mind. But on top of their good intentions, they had, folks that were, fairly insidious in the laws and things that they tried to get through. Decision makers, and I'll say you see it even today, bills are being passed where the decision makers have a poor understanding. They haven't read the legislation. They haven't read the staff report. They haven't put the time in to understand what it is they're actually passing and what their colleagues are pushing through. So there's a lack of due diligence. There's way too much trust, across, different colleagues and all that to assume that everybody wants the best thing. But then pile on top of that the political pressure, the fear of election cycles, people basically speaking with their wallets when it comes to politics, and you put all of that on top of decision making, and there's no surprises that we have a history of bad decision making and a history of perpetuating policies and plans that aren't in everyone's best interest. And again, this underlying premise of perpetuating an idea, like what do we want to be as a country, where do we want to go, and I got to go back to that original thing I said in our last discussion, which is the why. Why are we doing any of this in the first place, right? If it isn't that sort of genuine human just cause, then why is a piece of legislation being passed? And I don't think we ask ourselves those questions enough of, when you see a new bill come out that has to do with affordable housing or something, we all, may automatically assume it's, got its best intention, but its application after 20 years, might not be that. And so anyway, so there's a lot to unpack, with this conversation, but I really do think it comes down to that, unfortunately, we're not given all of the tools as we grow up. And I could say even in college, I mean, I took plenty of classes, and even in college, I was not given all the information, or in some cases, even the right information. So, how do we fix that? I mean, that's, probably not something we're going to solve today, but it's a big part of the issue.
Yeah. No, thank you for everything you offered there, Matt. And and I think it's important as you name all of that we not think of our history as all bad or all good, right? You have to be able to sit with both. That we have a history, that there are aspects of it that are good, that we celebrate, we want to honor, and there are also things that have been bad, and we have to be able to sit with that and work through both the good and the bad as we understand that history, and being willing to kind of tell that as we understand its impact and how it's played out in our country. And I think that many times can be challenging because you feel like if you are now knowing the bad, you still can't celebrate the good. And it doesn't mean that those two things are true. You can acknowledge both, right, as you sit with it and what it means. That's everything you said. I appreciate that. And Marianne, how are you sitting with this?
Well, I like the gentleman that reminded us that while there are more opportunities for all, that doesn't mean that we're still looking at equity in people's ability to take advantage of achieving or take advantage of those opportunities. And it's a matter of everything we've talked about, having experienced different things, and the intentional racism that kept minorities down and blighted minority neighborhoods and all the same things. And it's definitely going to be a matter of education. And I love what Martin Luther King said. It's not the oppression and cruelty of the bad people. The tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty of the bad people, but the silence of the good people. And at some point, we all have to agree, or we have to start, we have to wake people up and say, you just got to stop. You've just got to stop. And I made a little speech during a council meeting as we were, working on the Ready Commission. And I said, at some point, everyone has to decide that they're tired of the assumptions and applying negative stereotypes and, the outright racism that clearly exists. And you have to make a decision, and it starts with me. We have to make it one person at a time. And then not only does it have to start with me, but we have to start speaking out. And the minorities are speaking out now. That's what we're seeing in the marches and everything. But we need to speak out and not tolerate that kind of activity or, allowing these types of things to happen. And if we don't speak out, it's just going to keep happening. And I'll use a good example. We had a great pastor. And he said, I just won't tolerate gossip. If anybody comes to me and starts talking about somebody else, he says, I'll just take them by the hand and say, well, let's go talk to that person. So people stopped talking to him about gossip, but he did something about it. He said he wasn't going to participate, and he condemned those that were participating in it. Mm-hmm. And sure, you're going to alienate some people, but some people need to be alienated if they're going to continue to think in those terms and point fingers at other people. We've just got to stop, and it begins with me, and it begins with how I teach my children and what I teach my children.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There's just the acknowledgement of what it means to be brave in this space. And again, I want to acknowledge the council willingness to lean in this space. This is acknowledgement of you trying to find what it means to be brave. And what does it mean to lead in this space, and how are you sitting with this as you think about your own leadership? And as Zach was saying, being able to still sleep at night, right? About the decisions that you make. Zach, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. These conversations are good, and they sort of spur some more thoughts from me. And I just sort of didn't want to let this one pass. But we talk about history, we talk about education. And there's really like two education systems. There's a system that I learned, someone as someone that would identify also as a white man that learned in school. But then there's also this education or this history that people were actually living. They were living this and trying to deal with these systems like in real time. It was something that I'm, been thinking about, and it's just because I didn't learn it doesn't mean it certainly didn't exist. And I know we don't feel that way. But seeing as we go around the room and we have these conversations, it was just something again that stuck out to me, and seeing it in that video that people that were moving to or trying to move to these suburbs were living redlining in real time. And, we're sort of learning about it 50, 60 years later. Mm-hmm. It's just something I didn't want to let go. Just try to understand that.
No, I appreciate that. And it's true, right? That people have different lived experiences. As Stu was sharing, growing up in the 60s or 70s, we definitely have been in rooms where we've done trainings where people of color, Black families, individuals can talk about living through it, growing up in the 50s or 60s. In fact, I remember there was a training we did a couple of years ago. We were in Connecticut when we all were in person, and we showed a portion of this video around redlining. And remember how they talked about the wall being built in Detroit with the white family on one side and the Black family? A Black woman stood up like, that was my neighborhood. And we were like, wow. So let's talk about that experience. It was like, so people, this is a real space, right? For people to talk about. I remember exactly when they built the wall. And so she brought a very real moment to that space, right? So you're right. I think just naming that. But I also want to acknowledge, though, that even though this is might be new to you, it doesn't mean that you still don't have lived experiences too. Now, what you're learning is what it meant to live as a white person. And Jillian will talk a little more about this, about whiteness, about how do we understanding whiteness in the context of being white, right? And you've still navigated through systems, and you still have that history, but maybe reflection will give you a different perspective on that history as you think about those same systems, right? And that's a strength you bring as you think about what more you could do to really address those systems, right? So important to not acknowledge you still bring that history into the space, right? And understanding the system that we're talking about. And one of the things I also appreciate, and I know we want to be pivoting and kind of moving on, but one of the things I want to and I think Zach, you brought up, is understanding the local piece of this. As we talk about that history, and while we know that again, Temecula hasn't been around for a very long time, there is important to kind of think about the surrounding areas of Temecula, right? Regions, right? And understanding how redlining and racial covenants and blockbusting played out in its own, as you think about your own story. And this one is just looking at the Los Angeles, San Diego, which we know had redlining maps. And you could see the redlining map over here in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And you could then look at a more recent census population of that region to get a sense of where people are living now in the 2020, 2010 is not accidental, right? It has a lot more to do with intentional policies, people that intentionally design policies, government that was intentionally involved of saying who can get loans, who could not get loans. As you think about policies that we're reinforcing now, 80 years later, it's important to kind of sit with that. And this is kind of another, I think one was Los Angeles and one was San Diego. I think this one was Los Angeles and this was San Diego's redlining map. So you can kind of see kind of the comparison, if you will, of, doing a quick snapshot, right? Just kind of understanding history and its implications to how we think about policy today, right? And thinking about where neighborhoods are. And even while, Temecula may not have a redlining map, there still is a narrative behind Temecula, right? Even as you think about where majority of white people are living in your city versus where majority of Hispanic or Latin community members are living, where majority of your Black residents are living, where the majority of your Asian and Pacific Islanders are living. Like there's a narrative there, right? And being able to sit with that too, as Zach was saying, that localized piece is also part of the work that we want to be able to do, and as we kind of lean in. So before we kind of transition, let me just check in with my facilitators again really quickly. Jordan and Jillian, you've been listening and seeing if you have any kind of reflections before we kind of transition that you wanted to bring into the space. I know Jordan went the last time first. Let me have maybe Jillian go first, and then I have Jordan go after Jillian.
Sure. Yeah, housing. And just thinking about housing shapes our childhood. And Leon, you spoke into the room, Detroit, and I grew up in a predominantly white suburb of Detroit, right? And so the idea of how white flight impacted the city in my own childhood just feels really resonant. And even thinking about, I was living in another suburb of Detroit just before moving here to Minneapolis. And I just found out we still have there's a racial, like the neighborhood I lived in, had racial covenants, meaning that we're just on the border of Detroit. And it was like our racial covenant said no Black folks could own the homes. Right. And so it's not just, I think that this is the thing that's been really resonating with me today, is it's not just, we're talking sort of in past tense. We're using a lot of past tense language. And the reality is it's still our living reality. These past tense actions created our living reality today and are creating, right, the lived reality for what we'll be talking about in the past tense in 20 years. We're still recreating those systems, even though it's often unintentional and maybe not as egregious as redlining, but we are absolutely still recreating those systems of segregation, dehumanization, and like just perpetuating whiteness. So that's just what I'm really sitting with as we're having these discussions and listening.
Yeah, Jillian, I really appreciate you bringing all of that into the space. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay. I just want to first affirm what you offered, and to add, I think what I was sitting with is just that legacy piece. And, similarly, my grandparents who live in Fresno, California, live in a redlined community. And so having understanding now through the information and the work that I'm engaged in to understand why they have the highest asthma rates, to understand why they have one grocery store for the entire population because of zoning and local ordinances that were passed. And so having that kind of context and seeing how that then is playing out contemporarily, and that is a common story across this country, but we don't have a common memory about that. And so naming that in terms of that experience, but also wanting to, and we'll get a little deeper into this as we go through the next portion, but that piece around intention, and really, I won't say it all here, but further exploring intention and what that means. And so I just want to affirm what everyone has said thus far, and kind of leave it there for right now.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan and Jillian. Appreciate everything you had to offer. We know we've kept you in front of the screen nonstop here for a pretty long time. We want to give you a 5-minute non-screen step away time. So if you want to just take a 5-minute break, we will reconvene in 5 minutes, and we'll see you then.
Leon, we can.
All right, can you guys hear me? Welcome back.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everybody. Sorry, didn't mean to start another song. I thought one song was just enough for the break. So appreciate the space that we've been in. I'm gonna turn it over to Jordan, and Jordan is gonna kind of do some refresher, but obviously our space here is to lean in a little bit more and also get a chance to have some dialogue with you. So I'll turn it over to Jordan.
Thank you, Leon. And so as we are moving in, I want to first acknowledge this quote here from the late, great James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So I want y'all to think about that as we come back from the break. So with this next portion, really want to spend some time reviewing in terms of normalizing racial equity around language, about racism and equity. And the first thing I want to do as we kind of pivot into this is just to ask you all, you've heard both terms equality and equity, I'm assuming. When you hear those terms, do they mean the same thing to you?
Nope. I think that's the easy answer. I mean, equality is an objective, and it makes this assumption that everybody's at the same level or platform. And equity is, Randy, I think at one of our presentations had this great graphic that showed, sort of those, and it, had to do with people sort of looking over a fence to a ballpark, if I remember correctly. And so the equality was, everybody's able to see, equally into the ballpark, and equity was that not everybody can see equally into the ballpark. So you have to sort of prop them up and help them, all be at that similar level. Did I get that right, Randy?
Leon, Councilmember Ron is referring to that same slide that Gare and you have shown as well. So well done, Councilmember Ron.
Jordan, I'll jump in to maybe sort of add to that and answer your questions. I think oftentimes they're just intertwined. I think just collectively as a community, we sort of intertwine those without sort of the real definition of what those words mean and what that looks like on the ground.
Thank you, Zach, for that additional offering and context. And as we're moving through this, what I want to do now is to show that visual that has been referenced by Randy, in terms of equality really focusing on sameness and assuming that folks have the same starting place. And you can see here that that goal is not achieved. And then, however, if we don't provide everyone with the same thing, but really account for a goal of equity or a goal of justice and providing folks with what they need, they're able to achieve that goal. And so, again, with this, just wanting to note that people's individual needs that are different is not a personal failing or a lack of something within themselves, but really taking into consideration and into context the legacy that we've mentioned earlier in this conversation today about how folks are currently situated in 2021 as a result of decades and generations of policies, practices, and procedures. And so with this next image, really want to just build a little bit further on this point as we think about with this image, just that the ground is sloping as you move from left to right, and the fence increasing in size, but also to kind of pose a question of, as we get back to the why, oftentimes with this illustration, the goal is stated as watching the game from behind the fence. And so to really further interrogate why is the goal to watch the game from behind the fence? And to really begin to explore questions as to why was this fence built in the first place? Who was this fence built to have on the inside and or to have excluded or on the outside? And so using that as a, just, for the sake of this example, but to think about that in terms of your governing and policy decisions, and to, even further explore why aren't these folks perhaps playing in the game, or why aren't they in the stands, or perhaps in a skybox, or having some kind of cooperative ownership of the team. And so just posing those questions to you as we kind of move through, but want to just quickly pulse check if this difference between equality and equity are clear for folks. Okay, seeing some head nods around that. Thank you all. So I'll move us to the next portion here, with some review around racism. And so I know we often may hear about racism really as at the individual level, the kind of interpersonal prejudice or bias, discrimination based on race, but really wanting to kind of move us to a collective understanding of racism in the context of a system and operating systemically. And that system being based on the superiority of white people and inferiority of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders and other people of color. And to understand that as well, how that shows up at the institutional level through policies, practices, and procedures, and the ways in which they work better for white people than for non-white people that I've listed previously, as well as structurally in terms of that historical and contemporary reality when these institutions begin to compound and create further impacts and inequities. And so with this next slide, again, really wanting to just further emphasize in terms of a system and continuing to understand this as a system and that difference from individual discrimination, prejudice, or bias. And really the ongoing historically and contemporarily, kind of use of institutional power through policy, practices, and procedures. And so with this slide, really wanting to, again, take a quick kind of interactive poll from you. If you could just raise your hand if you've ever been in a conversation where maybe someone said or did something and then maybe was called a racist and the response was, "I'm not racist." Anybody ever experienced that? Yeah, seeing some head nods and some hand raised around that. So this next piece is really to kind of further explore that kind of stance of not racist, and to move us away from what I would say is somewhat of a kind of a quote unquote neutral stance, and to push us into an active stance of anti-racism. And so really to be kind of taking note of, what are the actions that I'm taking moment by moment that are either advancing anti-racism, and as we think about equity and improving outcomes for all people and humanity, or kind of taking maybe a neutral stance, which is not actively resisting against a system that's operating, or the other stance, which could be kind of, whether you're actively advancing a racist action or belief. And so with this slide, really wanting to just emphasize the difference between racism and anti-racism. And just that racism creates policies, practices, and procedures that produce or sustain racial inequity between racial groups. And that racism generates racist ideas to further support and justify the racial inequity. And so one brief example that I bring to the space around that is, it may be familiar to some of you, but over the last year, particularly earlier on, Leon referenced the disproportionality of COVID contractions for Latinx populations, as well as the death rate for Black and Indigenous people. And so once that, first and foremost, that data wasn't being disaggregated by race and ethnicity. And so once that data, then, there were a lot of calls for folks to disaggregate that data. And then you began to see those inequities in the data. Folks then kind of in the media, it was being portrayed that, well, there's higher rates of death or of contraction because Black people aren't taking COVID as seriously, or Latinx populations or Indigenous populations aren't taking COVID as seriously as white people. And that's how you can account for the disparities that we're seeing. And so that being a racist idea to support and justify the underlying racial inequities. In comparison to anti-racism, which is really focused on creating policies, practices, and procedures that produce or sustain racial equity between racial groups, and an anti-racist idea, generating anti-racist ideas to support and justify racial equity. For example, to say no racial group is taking COVID-19 more seriously than any other racial group. And to then really, again, Matt, as you brought into the space earlier, to further explore the why. What is causing, or what is underlying this inequity that we're seeing in terms of COVID-19? So the next piece that I wanted to get to is really, again, in terms of shifting our questions. And so really moving from individuals to systems. So shifting from blame to what are the causes? Similarly here, moving away from the intentions, what did they mean, or what was their attitude, to the impacts? What were the actions? What were the outcomes? moving from prejudice to systems thinking in terms of what institutions are responsible for the inequities that we're seeing. And lastly here, moving away from a grievance of how can we maybe fix what just happened to some solutions that really focus on what proactive strategies and solutions can we put in place so that this doesn't happen again and again and again. So with this, this was referenced earlier, but from infant mortality to life expectancy, race is the single strongest predictor of how well one will do in this country. And we see that in the education system, housing, healthcare, criminal legal system, to name a few. I'm going to share a couple brief examples to just share a little bit of data around this. And so this first example is from some data from the CDC, where they did a study around maternal mortality risk and controlled for everything but race. And what they found was that Black women face higher maternal mortality risk, nearly 3 to 4 times the rate of white women or women of other races. And so you can see that they're listed with the 44 deaths per 100,000 in comparison to 13 and 14 respectively per 100,000. Some other just brief points to highlight in terms of thinking about the 6 in 10 people that are in US prisons are Black or Latinx, while being about 30% of the US population. Similarly, education, 65% of Black or Latinx men are graduating from high school in comparison to 80% of white males. Unemployment rates being twice as high for Black and Native or Indigenous populations than for white people. And lastly, there nearly 60% of Black and Latinx people spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And so this just being a brief slide we wanted to share with you all from Dreams Deferred, from some research they did in 2019 around the median family wealth today. And so you can see white families here with $147,000 in comparison to Latinx families with about $6,600 and Black families with around $3,600. And so really noting this in the context of the racial wealth gap and the stark and increasing differences that are currently present. And the last couple of things I wanted to leave you all with are around really thinking about what does racial equity require as we think about anti-racist policies. And this work really being focused on closing the gaps so that race is no longer the single strongest predictor of one's success as we think about improving outcomes for everybody. The other pieces are really to think about targeted systemic changes that focus on improvements for those who have historically and contemporarily been worse off. And lastly, they're moving beyond services and really focusing on the root causes of racially inequitable outcomes. And the last slide that wanted to highlight, which speaks a little bit more to what you had introduced earlier around seniors, but really focusing on systems of oppression and the ways in which they overlap. And again, noting here race as the single strongest predictor of one's success, but understanding the ways in which it intersects with gender, sexuality or sexual orientation, ability, class, to name a few, and how those compound inequities show up, right? And so to really be thinking about what was coined Intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s. And to think about if we were what are the ways that we can develop intersectional solutions that would then further the ability for us to imagine solutions that look very different than if we're only focusing on one of these systems of power and oppression. And so with that, I want to pass it to Jillian as we go to this Kindy's quote.
Thank you so much for helping us continue to normalize the language and really root ourselves in the foundation of systemic, right, systems, and how we reframe to think about anti-racism versus racism. And so Kendi talks about the heartbeat of anti-racism being able to tell the truth about, and I think tell the truth about where racism sort of operates in your own body and mind and heart. And I think, Mayor Edwards, this really comes to your point of like, the change starts with me, right? And when I first read Kendi's work, honest to goodness, it changed my life as a white person committed to developing an anti-racist way of life. Kendi distinguishes between the word racist as an identity and racist as a descriptor of policy, behaviors, and ideas, right? Policy, practice, and procedures. And Kendi says, if an action or policy is disproportionately harmful to people of color, then it's racist. And it's literally that straightforward. And this thinking freed me from the clutches of worrying about whether I was a good or a bad person. If racist ideas popped into my head, or right, or I thought, I recognized the racist conditioning that is in my life. Because if we consider that we live in a country that was built on systemic racism, then we have been conditioned our whole lives to believe it. So of course racism is going to show up in some of our thoughts and actions. And so Kendi's idea of like telling on yourself, confessing, has honestly changed my whole life, because mistakes are inevitable. But by starting to admit the scary truths, I didn't have to be afraid of being found out anymore, right? Because I was telling on myself. And just a quick story of how this shows up, because I think one of the things that's really important is that white people actually start modeling this in anti-racism work. And so for me, I told you know a little bit about where I used to live, and now I live in Minneapolis. And we moved from a predominantly white suburb in Michigan to a multiracial neighborhood in Minneapolis. And we moved about 1.5 years ago. And I have to admit that when we moved, the minute we moved, the racist ideas started like flooding into me. Those ideas of like associating people of color with bad neighborhoods, danger, et cetera. And even though we actively chose to live in this neighborhood and we're super excited about it, honestly, I started locking my windows, double checking my doors, and being on high alert when walking at night, right? And so it's really important to start telling that story. One, because you can see I didn't explode into or burst into flames when telling it, but also once I realized what I was doing, what was happening, both in my head, in my heart, and in my actions, rather than pretending my behavior wasn't motivated by racist ideas, I started with some self-compassion, right? I gave myself a little grace about the conditioning of the world, and I got to know my neighbors, right? And it's this really beautiful, wonderful neighborhood. But I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't been practicing telling on myself, practicing willing to start with me. So I'll toss it back to you, Jordan, but I just think it's an important thing to model.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jillian. And appreciate you bringing that into the space. I know we got a bit of time, so I may be passing it back to you to go through the next piece in terms of our part 3.
Oh, and I think the last piece before we transition, Jordan has named a lot around anti-racism, and Jillian's going to go a little bit deeper as we talk about whiteness and microaggressions. But we wanted to play this short clip that brings into the space, if you haven't seen it before, the framing. What does it mean to have these real conversations that Jillian and Jordan were talking about? So this was one of our first real talks that we had that we wanted to bring into the space that we feel really names a lot to really sit with as we talk about what it takes to do the work.
Tim, you have written a book about this subject from a different perspective. What are your thoughts, opening thoughts about where we are in America right now?
Well, in the 3 minutes, 3 to 5 that we've been given, I'll do my best to answer it. And I know we're going to get deeper into this conversation as we go, so I'll save some of what I want to talk about for that. But I really appreciate the way that you framed the discussion at the outset, because at least on 2 occasions I heard you reference something that we really don't do very much in this country, and that is you referenced systemic racism, and you referred to it in that way. And I think that's important. In fact, it's critical, not just for the National League of Cities effort, but for our conversation as a country, because too often what we do, and I think we all know this, is we look at racism as that thing that happened in Charleston. That is to say, and when I say that thing that happened, I'm not talking about the generations of institutional racism. I'm talking about the thing that happened this summer. We look at that as racism. We say, well, Dylan Roof walks into a church and massacres 9 people, and the city comes together, and the state comes together, and the country grieves, and that's racism. And then we sort of wash our hands of it because we say, well, thankfully, that doesn't happen every week. That doesn't happen all the time. That's an anomaly. But we have to be prepared to look at racism as something that's far deeper than that, and not about bigotry, not about overt hatred, and not just about that type of random retail violence, because that's retail violence. We got wholesale violence. And by that, I mean, if you're going to understand what happened in Baltimore in the last 6 months, you cannot start with Freddie Gray, and you cannot start even with the police department in Baltimore. You have to start with the fact that that is a community that was wrecked by so-called urban renewal. That was violence. When they come in and they put the interstate through your community and they knock down your business and they knock down your apartments and they make folks huddle into small crowded housing and they essentially lock them in a holding pen. I mean, we talk about housing and education. We talk about neighborhoods as if it's not about racism. We act like folks just ended up where they ended up. But let's be clear, this thing that we in this country call the ghetto, that was created. And it wasn't created by black people, and it wasn't created by poor people. It was created by folks who were usually not black and definitely not poor as a holding pen for the people they didn't want to live amongst them. So we have to be prepared to call that violence. If you don't call zoning laws and redlining violence, even though it does violence, and you don't call it racism, then how are we going to solve that? So I want us to frame this conversation the way that you've done it. And I think that's where we are as a country. We're still stuck in this mode of describing racism as this interpersonal thing rather than understanding it structurally and institutionally. And I think until we get to that place where we can talk about not just that individual cop who does something wrong in the community, which we can see plenty of examples of that, but until we deal with the mentality that says that spatial isolation, segregation, residential isolation, black and brown kids going to schools 12 times more likely to be places of concentrated poverty. That's not an accident. People didn't choose that. And so I think that's where we need to go, is to frame the conversation in a way that reminds us that we're talking about systemic and structural violence. And we can't just talk about the sort of retail level stuff, as important as that is, and as horrific as a hate crime is. To be really honest, at the risk of being hyperbolic, aspects of this country's history have been an intergenerational hate crime against certain people. And that's just the truth. We don't like to use language like that. Sounds un-American, unpatriotic, whatever kind of terminology we use, but that's real. And unless we're prepared to do it that way and have that conversation that way, I'm afraid we'll keep spinning our wheels, coming back, having the same conversations over and over and over again. The reason that low-income black folks were the ones hit hardest in New Orleans was not an accident. And what was stunning to me about it, and I lived there for 10 years, the only people that were shocked by what happened, for the most part, were white folks. Black folks weren't shocked that they got uprooted. They weren't shocked that they got left behind and forgotten. That was the history of that community, right? Urban renewal did that. Interstate highway construction right through the Treme, the oldest free black neighborhood in this country, did that. And so it was just same thing, different day. A little bit more extreme, and the cameras were on, and they made movies about it. But it was the same stuff that had always been happening. So we have to go back to that systemic understanding, which is something I think the movement historically knew, but most of our leaders have sometimes forgotten.
Wow. So we're going to have a real conversation today, aren't we? I think I'm ready. I think I'm ready.
So yeah, so that as you sit with it, you may have heard it before, but that's the I think the context for you as a council. Like, how do you have those real conversations? Like, what's the work for you as a council to really unpeel it, get comfortable? And while Clarence may not have been comfortable 6 years ago, he's been on that journey, right, to get more comfortable talking about it. I've been on that journey. All of us are on this journey about what it takes to be able to talk about it. And so wanted to bring that into the space. And so let me turn it over to Jill to wrap us up on the last part of our thing.
Yeah. So Tim Wise talks about needing to move the conversation from individual and interpersonal to systemic, right? And that's critical because we have to remember that individuals make up systems. And so we have to work at multiple levels simultaneously. And Angela Davis reminds us that the personal is political and the political is personal. And a place that we often get stuck around the individual level that we want to name is microaggressions. So what are they? It's the idea that microaggressions are the everyday slights, indignities, and put downs, insults that members of marginalized groups experience in their day-to-day interactions. And generally they come from individuals who are unaware that they have engaged in offensive or demeaning behavior. And we often focus on race, but microaggressions can happen across those intersecting identities. And so it's important to think about, keep that in context too. And this graphic shows a few of the common microaggressions that our Black, Indigenous, and people of color colleagues face every day. And these comments do occur at the individual level, but they're contextualized. We're going to continually contextualize it in systemic racism, which is what makes them so much more than an individual insult. So on that note, for white people, we as a society fall into the trap of believing that systemic racism only harms people of color, right? But that simply isn't the case. As the white civil rights activist Ian Braden reminds us, the battle is and always has been for the hearts and minds of white people in this country. The fight against racism is not something we're called on to help people of color with, but that we need to become involved as if our lives depend on it, because in truth, they do. And the data bears that out. What you see is that the systemic racism affects our economy. So white folks are dying to protect whiteness. And we are hindering our relationships by avoiding being in interracial, cross-racial working environments. And these are just a few of the ways that racism actively harms all of us, and white folks in particular. And that's not to say, and that's not to be white centering, but it's important for white folks to wrap their head around the fact that racism actually harms us too. Because systemic racism makes us as a nation disconnected, angry, and afraid of building relationships. And for white folks like me, it's also about the fear of changing the status quo, right? What am I gonna lose if things start changing? And there's a specific and ruthless culture that creates, protects, and enforces systemic racism, and that's white supremacy. So if we come back up to, we're gonna zoom up to that systems level thinking, right? White supremacy is the convergence of racism at the structural, institutional, and individual levels embedded into the fabric of social and cultural norms. That is a lot to sort of wrap your brain around in a real quick amount of time. But what this tells us is that the US system fundamentally conditions us to believe not that just white is neutral, but that in claiming neutrality, it actually sets us up to internalize that white is better, superior, innocent, and that internalized superiority for white folks or internalized oppression for people of color means, like how it plays out, the implications are that people of color are structurally disenfranchised and marginalized by the system, right? And we saw that play out in all sorts of ways, really focusing on housing today. And in this country, because of our history, the impact it has and continues to harm Black and Indigenous folks really in particular and very powerfully. And earlier the mayor asked what we can do about it, right? And the first step is making a choice to act differently is awareness. If we're not aware of what informs our choices, we can't change them. And so we're really talking about how awareness of these systems are operating in our own bodies and in our how society has conditioned us to believe these. And that, right, the baseline is that we live in a culture that was set up to advantage whiteness, which means our culture was built for folks who look like me. But that it's really important to remember that it's historically based and institutionally perpetuated. And it's a system of exploitation and oppression for the purpose of building, defending, and maintaining a system that concentrates wealth, power, and privilege in the hands of a few. So let's look at how this plays out in our culture today. Quick note about culture. We often use an iceberg as a metaphor to talk about culture, being both what is tangible and what's invisible, right? And so what's above the waterline are things like dress, food, music, and behaviors, the things you can sort of see. And what's below the waterline is the values, beliefs, and norms we use to interpret and make meaning of what's above the waterline. And so this is a really useful framing for to think about white supremacy as well. So the upper iceberg, so if we go to the next slide, what we can see are all those things that we can really easily name as racist, right? And folks who engage in these behaviors are largely going to be censured publicly. Things will be deemed in bad taste, requiring apology, hate speech, domestic terrorism, as the actions get more extreme. But these are all these actions are violent and engage over 400 years of dehumanizing policy, practice, and procedure. But these ones that we can see above the waterline are the acts that are easy to point a finger to and call racist. But what's beneath the waterline is what's much more insidious. And so what you see here, I appreciate you leaning in. I can see you leaning in to start reading the small print, right? What you see is that white supremacy is operating in every nook and cranny of our lives, even if it remains largely invisible to us. White supremacy does not require individual bigotry and prejudice to operate. It is absolutely baked into the operating system of our country, and we all actively participate in reproducing it every day, whether we intend to or not, right? We're always going to keep coming back to intent and impact in these conversations, because we have to really stop relying on intent and really start honoring the impact and implications of our behaviors, beliefs, actions, policies, practices, and procedures, right? Barbara Smith tells us that white supremacy culture relies on entrenched patterns and practices to consistently disadvantage people of color and privilege white folks. And if you are having a hard time with that language of white supremacy, I understand. I used to resist it until I came to really understand that when you have a system where white people predominantly hold the power, have the wealth, and make the rules, what else can you call it but supremacy? Yeah, and so I'm watching time, and I want to honor our time. So I'm just gonna say the question, that we want to remember is that white supremacy, the poet Guante says, the white supremacy is not a shark, it is the water. And the truth is we're all conditioned by the system of supremacy and white supremacy, racism and white supremacy. And the question, right? So it's hard to even know that you're wet when it's the water. So the question really is, now that you do know you're wet, what are you going to do about it?
If I could ask a question really quick. So are white people the only racists?
Great question. Great question. What's, as you're reflecting on, I'm kind of curious how you're processing that.
Well, judging somebody by their color or making assumptions about somebody the way that they're perceived. Well, all the stuff that you saw below the line, I mean, below the water level. So are white people the only racists? Can anybody else be racist?
So I'll reflect, and I think there are two ways I would reflect. Two ways I would reflect on this. First, if you heard Jordan as he was talking about racism and how we defined racism, and typically when we hear racism, we hear it as a pejorative, as an insult, and part of what we are helping to really name is understanding that when we're talking about racism, it's a description of a system. Right. And when we're talking about racism, we're describing a system that's based in white supremacy, that's based in privilege, that's been designed, that says white people are on the top, Black people are on the bottom, people of color are somewhere in between, right? But we've created the hierarchy as we've understood this structure. And so when we talk about racism, it's like you're reinforcing those systems. You're describing, and all of us could be doing that at some point. Right? Because if white supremacy is the water, all of us have been in the water. Right? And so all of us to a person could be reinforcing those systems. Right? And so the work to be anti-racist is to say, I want to be against those systems. I realize that these policies have been designed and I'm trying to work to be anti-racist. It doesn't mean that I might not still do racist things. Right? As I try to work to be an anti-racist, but you have to hear racism as a description, not an insult, right? As you're saying, I'm doing racist things means I might still be reinforcing these same systems. And I realize that might happen because I'm in the water.
Well, you're you're automatically part of it, whether you realize it or want to realize it or not. But I guess I'm talking about on the, on an individual level, because here locally, I mean, we run into our neighbors, we see people, we talk to individuals. And so I don't want to divide people for any reason. I don't want to divide people for any reason, but I guess I just go back to that question. Can racism lie with anyone, or is it just with white people?
So yeah, and I'll have maybe Jillian or Jordan jump in, because I think the first part, what I described, I wanted to make sure you were sitting with understanding what racism is, or when we're describing it as a system. And I think and I think the second part you're describing is understanding the differences between racism and prejudice and bias and discrimination, as you're using it as how people can use it. And so I think within that space, when we talk about racism, there's, again, reinforcing that system is really talking about understanding power and privilege and where that sits as you were describing the system. And within that, I think the way we want you to sit with it is to see that all of us can do racist things, whether you're white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, all of us can do racist things, right? And the work that we want to be committed to doing is to be against those, reinforcing those racist things. That's reinforcing a system that's based in white supremacy, right? That we're describing. So I want you to, I feel like maybe Jillian and Jordan can jump in, and maybe I'm not getting.
You're getting closer with, that helped. That helped me. I'm just trying to decide, and I understand racism on, the supremacy level and historical level and all that. And I think you can see that. I mean, the obvious things that we all look at is, slavery and the way, and redlining and those kinds of things. But I think talking about the day-to-day things, we deal with individuals. We love our neighbors, and I don't care what color they are. And so are we doing this assuming that only white people can be prejudiced or, do racist things? Or, I mean, are we all kind of in this together? Because when I say let it begin with me, I'm talking about the collective me. I'm talking about everyone having to battle their own demons and just set that aside because, it's not productive. It doesn't help anyone. It divides people. It hurts people. There's nothing good about it. So does that include everybody or only the white people, the ones that have to come to terms with things? Because it seems to me like, it takes two people to come together and shake hands and hug. So I guess I'm saying, what can we do for those people who don't like us because we're white, maybe just because of that? Because we know that there are people who don't like blacks just because they're black. They don't know you. They don't know you guys. They don't know you, but they just assume and they just hate you because. That's totally wrong.
Leon, can I jump in for 1 second?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think it's, what do I want to say? I need to stop and breathe, right? Like, whew.
I know that was a lot. I'm not uncomfortable talking about this because I know that I have changed my thinking a lot, and I've realized a lot of things that I was doing where I wasn't aware.
Great.
I wasn't aware. And so what are we the only ones that have to be aware, or
it's an important,
you know what I'm saying?
I do. And it, like, as I'm going to reiterate what Leon has told us a bunch of times, it's a really long journey, right? It's a really long journey. And it's not that we're the only people, right? We being white folks, right? I'm just going to name that thing.
Right.
It's not that white folks are the only people who have work to do, right? Because we are all in this system. And so we talked a little bit, we just started to talk about how white supremacy culture, right, is internalized. And for white folks, it's a sense of internalized superiority. And for folks of color, it gets internalized as internalized oppression. And so it plays out differently. And so we have different,
like a defense mechanism almost, because of all the negativity they've experienced and observed and seen in their neighborhoods and their families. And
sure. But so I think the point is that we all have work to unlearn, right? This re-education piece, as Matt was bringing up, we all have work to do, but our work is going to look a little different, right? And the point that Leon's making is like, we individually each have work to do.
Yeah.
And we individually make up systems. And so until we each individually do that work, look inside, put our defensiveness aside, and really get honest about what we're afraid of, what's uncomfortable for us, right? That then as we're individually doing that work, then we can collectively take responsibility. But that, and I think there's the piece of like, there's just a piece of, I think it's, I think this is what I want to say, is when I notice myself wanting to blame others or take it personally, right? That's a cue for me to get really curious about what I'm trying to avoid in myself. So I know that like when I start trying to distinguish myself from either those white people or those folks who want to blame me or make me feel bad or don't like me because I'm white, right? Whatever the narratives are, whatever the stories
now
I am.
You sound like me.
Right.
I don't automatically think people don't like me because I'm white, but I know that does happen, and it happens in reverse. And that's one of the problems that we have. It's based on assumptions and,
But so when I start telling those stories, right, about why I think somebody thinks this or doesn't, I recognize that I'm really trying to distance myself from whiteness, from the system of whiteness, and from the advantages that I get just because of the color of my skin. And that I'm really trying to reduce it to an individual moral conversation, right? Rather than keeping it at that systemic level, and acknowledging that how I benefit from, participate in, and perpetuate, even if it's unintentional.
Well, I guess, we need to know what the solutions are. To me, it's to get people together like this and build enough trust that you can speak freely. And I will freely admit the things that I've said or done, or, I used to use the word articulate all the time, and I realize now why that's not a good thing. But
Perfect example of a
about it.
microaggression, Mayor.
Yes,
Absolutely, great.
I never thought about it, and until somebody that takes it a different way has, trust me enough to tell me. And I have people like that. But how do we address that on a citywide scale? How do we get people together to talk and build that trust?
Yeah, and so I think I appreciate this dialogue, and again, Mayor, I appreciate you creating a space to wanting to lean in, because what you're modeling is exactly the space you want to create, and hopefully with your colleagues. I'm hoping even as they're listening that there's a willingness to lean in and have this conversation. We're not going to resolve it in the time we're in right now, but you want to create the space for it.
Come on, Leon.
But I do.
We can do this.
but I do have some thoughts about things to hold as you're having the conversation, right? And part of holding is understanding what we've been trying to reinforce, what racism is. And it's important to hold that as an aggregate at the larger level of the work, while distinguishing racism from, we all bring bias into the space, which we spent time last time talking about our bias, our unconscious bias and our conscious bias. We all can discriminate, we all can be prejudiced, but and they all have their own meanings behind them in terms of how that shows up in our individual action. And what's unique about racism, it's describing a system like any other ism. And we use it many times. Some people tend to use it as a pejorative to try to insult someone. But racism is intended to be seen as a description of a system that we've been wanting you to be able to sit with and understand that. So you're, even when you're hearing it described, and it might make you uncomfortable if someone's saying that's racist, they're describing maybe what role are you playing in that moment as you are reinforcing a system. And you have to hear it in that way. It's like, did I just do something to reinforce a system that's based on white supremacy? And I have to pause and do the work wherever you fall in that space, to pause and process, like, maybe what I just did, and willing to acknowledge I did just reinforce something that's based in this white supremacy system. That's the work of being able to do it. And also hold that as you do this work, that it's important to think about how you organize around people. And I think I shared this the last time, but I want to reinforce it as we talk about organizing around people, to hold people into 4 different groups, right? You'll have those that are your advocates. They're the ones that are championing this. They might be anti-racist. They're doing the work, whether they're white, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, Asian. They're out there doing the work, and they're in the community. And you want to organize around those advocates, because those are the ones that are vocally doing the work. And then you have the group that are your followers. Your followers are the ones that are, they might be supportive, but they're not the most vocal. And you want to still organize around your followers, because they're willing to be engaged in this space. They're willing to maybe put the sign in the yard or show up for the event, but they won't get on stage. But you still need to organize around your followers. Your third group are your skeptics. There'll be folks that have questions. They might be negative questions or positive questions, but you can't assume just because they have questions that they don't want to be a part of it. But how are you organizing around the skeptics? They just have questions. And what's the work you're doing to organize around your skeptics? And then your last group, it's important to name, are your resistors. That group will exist regardless of what you do.
Those are the ones we hear from. I mean, most often, I think those are the ones we hear from, right? Yeah.
Many times. And part of the work of organizing is making sure you're not finding yourself spending too much time organizing around one group, forgetting about your other groups. So you have to be very intentional about the work. You still need to organize around your resistors. And there's work you can do to organize with people that will disagree, by just acknowledging, as Matt was saying earlier, how you acknowledge people's humanity. They may not ever be supportive, but by acknowledging their people's humanity, even if they're resisting, they may become less resistant. They may never become supportive, but maybe they become less resistant as you just acknowledge people, their humanity, how they're showing up. So you want to organize around them, but you don't want to spend all of your time organizing around the resistors. You want to organize around skeptics as well, right?
Yeah, I think with the resistors, you have a tendency to empower them if you drop everything and focus only on that, because I think for the most part, they're going to be the most difficult to kind of bring along and, get buy-in and, try to join the group as a whole, everybody.
And that's why it's important that when you think about change actually, and there's a whole lot of research out there on how do you really get to change? If you're really thinking about what change looks like in your cities, many times you're thinking like you got to get 100% or 80% of the people on board to actually see change happen in your city. And it's much larger percentage, a much smaller percentage than you realize.
Yeah.
It's closer to 30%.
Yeah.
30%, if you get 30% of your city on board to drive this work, you'll start to see the kind of change that starts to move the work that you want to see within your city. So but you still got to organize around all the groups. So that you can get to the 30%, you still got to be intentional about the resistors, intentional about the skeptics, intentional about your followers, intentional about your advocates to get to that 30%, because you still want to bring everyone along in the work. And so I want to that frame I wanted to name, because I think what you're modeling is creating the space for that work to be able to have these dialogues as a council to really figure out how to organize.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And I want to be mindful. I know we were scheduled to end at the top of the hour. I see some people's faces like, Leon, you're supposed to wrap up at 4 o'clock.
My fault. It's always my fault. It's okay.
So I just want to be mindful. But I really appreciated the space that you offered towards the end to be able to sit with. And also just want to appreciate Council for allowing us to be in space with you again. And as you continue to be on this journey, we look forward to continuing to support you as you continue to build on this. And you can't take back now. The mayor now says we're a part of your family. So you can't let us go now that we're part of your family. And we appreciate being in that space with you as you continue.
Well, you love Temecula and Temecula loves you back. That's how it works.
Wonderful. Well, I don't know if I need to turn it back over to one of y'all to wrap up, but we just wanted to say thank you again. We're mindful of being a little bit past time, so thank you for allowing us to have a few more minutes past the, I think now it's afternoon for you, so happy afternoon to you guys. Yeah.
Well, I thank you, just for myself, because you've helped to clarify some questions I have, and I hope that my questions didn't offend anyone, or, the people didn't infer my intent or anything, but there's a lot to wrap your arms around. So what we would usually do now, I would go to council and I would say, does anybody have a question or comment? And so, guys, Zach.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. And I just want to start off by saying thank you to Leon, to Jillian, and Jordan for being here today. I genuinely appreciate the time you've taken out of your day to spend with us and sort of work through these conversations. It's very important work that we're doing, and so I just want to thank you for the presentation and that just helping us re-educate ourselves and continuing some education. I always try to leave some of these conversations with more questions than answers, and I think of the conversations we have today, and how do we translate these conversations that we had today into policy conversations that we have on a bi-weekly basis, whether that's housing or transportation or some of the services that we provide or offer our residents. So I just sort of pose that to my council colleagues. And then Leon, you really spoke to it. I had some notes about how do you continue this work? How do you bring everyone along on this journey, right? Because that is truly the goal. And this is a journey. There's no finish line. We will continue to do this work long after we're all gone. I think that's important. How do we bring our business community along, our faith community, our nonprofits, our educational systems, clubs, just the average resident? I really think that's where we need to collectively as a council, as an executive staff, really put our heads together and how do we leverage our abilities, how do we leverage our services that we have to help shape that narrative and bring people along. I think that's it's really important. And we're not going to bring everyone along. I mean, we can just acknowledge that and that's totally fine. But it is important that we don't invest too much time in those resistors and we work towards truly, genuinely bringing equity to our community. And then I'll leave on this, you know, I really, I believe, you know, in being a lifelong learner. I think that's important. And you hear that in certain professional circles, but let's not be lifelong learners for our profession, or if it means a pay raise or something that's tied to our financial well-being. I think there's so much information, and good information, mind you, out there that we can take and continue to learn every single day. We all don't know everything. We shouldn't even pretend that we do, and we can continue to learn just throughout our lives. So I really want to, you know, task not only the council and exec staff here, but just residents in general, that it is so important to learn, to listen, and really try to seek out good knowledge. I mean, there's a lot of bad knowledge out there as well, so we need to be mindful of that. And just realize also that, you know, the work we're doing in this space with the Ready Commission, with just having these conversations, we are setting a tone for our community. And not just for the residents that live here, but for the region as a whole. We're having these conversations at SCAG, and I know many of the other external organizations are having these same conversations. This is important work that we're doing. It shouldn't be minimized, and we should celebrate even these little successes today, like these trainings. So with that, I just really appreciate my council colleagues today that are here, that are truly leaning into these conversations and learning about often things we don't always learn about, and really just willing to get uncomfortable. Because when we said this last year, you know, being uncomfortable is the new comfortable, I guess. It's like, let's just be uncomfortable, because that's the reality. We can, you know, as a family, we can not want to talk about things at the dinner table, but that is truly not solving anything. We need to have these conversations. I need to understand your perspective, regardless of where you come from, what your background is. I need to know that. How I move through this world, I need to understand where everyone's coming from. So I certainly appreciate everyone's dialogue and thoughts and conversation today. So again, thank you all.
Thank you, Zach. That's excellent. Matt?
No, we've said a lot today. I don't need to add a whole lot else. I know we're pushed for a little bit of time here, but appreciate everybody coming together on this. There's obviously a lot of work we need to do, but this is a very important step forward. And Leon, Jordan, Jillian, appreciate your guidance as we take this journey together.
Thanks, Matt. Stu?
All right, I just had to get unmuted. Yeah, no, it really is about learning. And for someone like myself, who basically grew up most of my adult life, you know, spent in the white world, for lack of a better term, it's a new world out there. And so trying to learn the lingo and just using words that, you know, we all assume are fine,
right?
And then all of a sudden we realize that it's not fine. And so, you know, and that was all below that water line, which, you know, and we were all struggling to read it all as we were, but we do a lot of that stuff, totally unintentional, but totally we do it. And so it's just understanding that, and, you know, and do the work. I mean, like you were saying, I mean, I've read a couple of books, had a couple of book studies. And so it's been a very interesting journey, understanding. I mean, and that's what it's all about. It's just understanding, because, you know, we all have biases and things that kind of mold our world. And so it is about trying to kind of crack that mold a little bit and kind of let some other things seep in. So that's all I have to say.
Well, thanks, Stu. So, Mr. City Manager, anything?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I too want to thank Leon, Jordan, and Jillian for your time. The only thing that I'd like to add, actually two things. In today's day and age, you cannot turn on the news or read the paper without sort of living this conversation. It's been heightened. There is racism, there is hate, there's targeted racial groups that are occurring, whether it was, most recently in Atlanta or in the Asian American community, or Blacks, or the trial that's going on in Minneapolis. I mean, we are reminded of the work that we have to do. And kind of having said that, I could not be more proud to be affiliated with a city and an organization that has a city council that has dedicated themselves to this movement and to this learning and to this betterment of our city. Because let's face it, we wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for the city council. And if there wasn't political will to move this conversation and to have these hard conversations and actually do something sustainable to better ourselves, it wouldn't have happened. So my hat's off to you, the city council, the policymakers that are challenging us as an organization, but are also challenging our community, and you're wanting to better yourselves. So my thanks to all of you.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. Peter, anything?
No, I think Aaron said it all. It was very, very, very excellent presentation.
It really was. Randy?
No, just thank you to the city council, and thank you to the city manager, and thank you Leon and Jillian and Jordan, and just for leaning into this space today, and to all four of you for being here and being present and helping us work through this, and to the city manager, aka my boss, for letting me work in this space. So just that's it, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Yeah, you don't have a choice. You're not going any place. We're not letting you go. Well, closing remarks, Jordan, Jillian, Leon, anything? Are we going to get together and do this again?
We hope so. We absolutely look forward to doing that. And I can't remember if I did this activity, but I want to see if I have it as a way of wrapping up. And just because I really appreciate the space that you're in, and you're pushing yourselves to come up with new solutions, come up with answers and questions you've never done before. And if I start to do this activity, and if I've done it before, let me know, and we won't have to do it. We won't have to do it. But have I asked y'all to pick a number from 1 to 10?
Oh yeah, we did this.
All right. So
yeah.
So what I want to remind you is, don't come up with Denmark, kangaroo, and oranges strategies. As your
so many people about that.
That's my last remark. I appreciate the commitment, and it seems like Stu hasn't done it. So Stu's probably looking at us like, what just happened here? So can someone do the exercise on Stu so he kind of knows what happens? But that's my last message. No Denmark, kangaroo, oranges. Then
that was a great exercise. So if we have nothing else, I see other staff members who they have their lights out, so obviously they didn't want to be called on for any reason. So I'm just going to say thank you everybody for being here. Colleagues, I am so proud to work with you, and we live in a great city with great residents, and I think our residents are going to lean in too. Like I said, when you love Temecula, it loves you back. And we want everybody to feel like they're included, that they're part of this city, that they're being heard, and that we understand, and we'll make changes where we need to make changes. And the Ready Commission is going to help us to review policies, programs, procedures, and see if there's anything within the city structure that unintentionally, or not intentionally, because I don't believe that, but unintentionally makes people feel uncomfortable about participating, or somehow obstructs people from coming to meetings or enjoying programs or, projects that we have. So the Ready Commission is going to be busy, really busy, and we're thrilled to have them. It's a really great group. 7 individuals who are committed. And I'll tell you, we got how many, Randy? 85 applications, which is unheard of for commission seats. So that demonstrated to us the interest that the community has, in this topic. So I think we have a lot to look forward to. And I don't think none of us is afraid of, hard work. I think we kind of thrive on it. So thank you again for being here, and we will see you again. So with that, if I can find my gavel now that I put it away, meeting's adjourned.